There is a hill in Athens where something impossible still stands. The marble is broken. The roof is gone. 2,500 years of war, weather, explosion, and tourism have taken most of what was once there. What remains are columns, pale and enormous against the sky, catching the light the way bones catch light when everything else has been stripped away. This is the Parthenon, and if you stand beneath it long enough, you start to feel the weight of a question the building has been asking since the day it was finished. The people who built this were not sentimental. The ancient Athenians were traders, soldiers, philosophers, politicians, and they were ruthless in the way that people who build empires are always ruthless. They did not spend their money carelessly. They did not dedicate their greatest monument to something they found comforting or soft. They built it for a goddess who was born wearing armor. Inside this building, there once stood a statue, nearly 40 feet tall, gold and ivory, a woman in a battle helmet with 3 crests, a shield in one hand, in the other, a small winged figure of victory, the face of a monster pressed against her chest, a snake coiled at her feet. They called her the goddess of wisdom. Look at that image long enough, and a question forms that the ancient Greeks never fully answered, and that nobody since has managed to close. Why does wisdom need a helmet? Why does the goddess of reason carry the face of a creature that turns people to stone? Why did the most celebrated civilization in Western history choose, as their symbol of intelligence, something that looks like it was built for war? The stories about Athena are very old. They come from a world that understood certain things about power and knowledge, and the distance between them that we have mostly chosen to forget. These are the stories her symbols still remember. Every story about Athena begins with a man who was afraid. His name was Zeus. And fear was not something he was supposed to feel. He had already done the impossible once. He had overthrown his father, Cronus, who had overthrown his father before him, Ouranos, who had come before that, all the way back to the first shaping of things. Zeus had broken the chain that had seemed unbreakable. He had won a war against the Titans that lasted 10 years and remade the structure of the world. He sat at the top of everything, and everything answered to him, and he was terrified. Not of enemies. He had defeated every enemy. Not of challenges to his throne. He had survived all of them. What he could not survive. What kept him awake, in the way that only one specific kind of fear keeps powerful people awake, was something much harder to fight than any enemy. He was afraid of what came next. There is a pattern buried inside the oldest Greek stories, and Zeus knew it better than anyone because he had lived it. Sons replace fathers. The child takes what the parent built and goes further. Cronus had known this and had tried to stop it by swallowing his children whole, and it had not worked, because Zeus survived and came back and did exactly what Cronus feared. The wheel turned. It always turned. Zeus was now standing where Cronus had stood, and he understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has personally destroyed his own father, that the wheel did not stop turning just because you were the one on top. So when he fell in love with Metis, he was already watching for the thing that love could produce. Metis was a Titaness, one of the oldest beings in existence. Her name meant counsel, or wisdom, or something between the two, that the Greek language understood better than any single English word can capture. She was the one the gods consulted when they needed to think clearly. She was the one who had helped Zeus defeat Cronus in the first place, who had given him the mixture that caused Cronus to regurgitate the children he had swallowed. Without Metis, there was no Zeus. He knew that. He also knew what the prophecy said. The prophecy came from Gaia, the earth itself, the oldest voice. the one that had been watching the wheel turn since before anyone else existed. Gaia said that Meti was destined to bear children of surpassing power. The first child would be a daughter, equal to her father in strength and in wisdom. The second child would be a son, and that son would overthrow the Lord of gods and men. Zeus heard this and did what men who have achieved power through violence always do, when they hear that violence might come for them in return. He made a calculation. He could not defeat a prophecy. He had learned that much from watching his father try. He could not kill Metis, because killing someone that old and that fundamental to the structure of things had consequences that were worse than the problem. He could not simply walk away, because the child might already exist, already forming, already on its way. What he could do, what he did, was this. He talked to Metis. He was charming. He was the lord of gods and men, and he knew how to use that. He suggested a game, a transformation contest, the kind of thing the old stories are full of. Shapeshifters trying to outdo each other for the pleasure of it. Metis, who was wise about most things, was not wise about this particular man at this particular moment. She transformed. She became something small. Zeus swallowed her. There is a version of this story that tries to make it abstract, tries to turn it into pure symbol, tries to say it is really about how Zeus internalized wisdom, absorbed counsel into himself, became the source of good judgment by incorporating the most intelligent being in existence. That version is easier to sit with. The older version does not offer that comfort. In the older version, a man who was afraid of what a woman might give birth to solved the problem by making sure she could never give birth to anything again. He swallowed her. She was inside him, alive, still capable of thought, still offering counsel from within the walls of his own body, trapped there in the dark while the world outside went on without her. What happened to that counsel? What happened to that wisdom? Where did it go? The ancient Greeks gave one answer. It did not disappear. It built pressure. It grew. It became something. Inside Zeus, Meti was doing what she had always done. She was making something. She was crafting armor, small and perfect, piece by piece, in the dark, inside the god who had swallowed her. A helmet, a breastplate, greaves, a spear. She was building something that could not be swallowed, something that arrived in the world already protected. For a while, nothing happened. Zeus ruled. The world turned. Hera became his wife and bore children in the ordinary way. And Olympus settled into the rhythms of a place where enormous power has learned to organize itself into something that looks almost like peace. And then Zeus got a headache. Not a headache the way humans get headaches. The dull throb behind the eyes. The kind that yields to rest or willow bark tea. This was something structural. Something that felt like the inside of his skull was trying to become the outside. The pain grew past the point where even the Lord of gods and men could pretend it was manageable. He called for Hephaestus, his son, the god of the forge, the maker of things, the only being on Olympus whose hands understood how to shape matter into form. He told Hephaestus to open his head. What Hephaestus did next is the most extraordinary moment in the entire story of Athena, and it has been painted and sculpted and retold so many times that it has become almost familiar, which is a way of saying we have stopped actually looking at it. Hephaestus raised his axe. He split the skull of the king of the gods, and from that split, from that wound at the crown of everything, something came out that should not have existed yet, something that had been forming in the dark for longer than anyone knew, something that arrived in the world the way lightning arrives, already complete, already moving, already committed to its own nature before the world had any chance to shape it. She emerged fully grown, fully armed, helmet on her head, shield on her arm, spear in her hand. She let out a war cry the moment she hit the open air, and the sound of it was so enormous that the sky shook, and the sea rose, and the sun itself, they say, stopped for a moment, uncertain. Every god on Olympus went still. They had seen remarkable things. They had watched the world be made. They had witnessed wars that rearranged geography and battles that left marks on the structure of existence itself. But none of them had ever seen anything born the way this was born. Not from a mother, not from a womb, from the mind of the father who had tried to prevent it, from the trapped intelligence of the mother he had tried to contain. Athena stood in the light and looked at the world that was now hers to move through. She had not been taught how to hold a spear. She already knew. She had not been shown how to read a battlefield or calculate the angle of an attack or understand the difference between a war worth fighting and one that would only make the damage worse. She already knew all of it. She had never been held. She had never been frightened in the dark. She had never needed to learn. Slowly and painfully, that the world was larger than she was, and that other people in it had their own interior lives as real as hers. She had never been a child. And Zeus, who had been afraid of what Metis might produce, looked at what Metis had produced and felt something complicated settle in his chest. He had not been replaced. The prophecy had not come for him. The daughter had arrived, and she was extraordinary, and she was looking at him with eyes that already understood more than most beings learned in a lifetime. And she was his. He had swallowed her mother to prevent this. He had carried her in the darkness of his own skull, and what had come out of all that fear and containment and darkness was not his enemy. It was the thing he would love most in the world, whether that was the outcome Metis intended. Somewhere in the dark, where she had been crafting armor for a daughter she would never meet, is a question the old stories do not answer. They never do. Here is what nobody talks about when they talk about Athena's birth. They talk about the spectacle, the axe coming down, the war cry, the armor catching the light. They talk about it the way people talk about the most dramatic version of a story, which is to say, they talk about the part that makes the best image and leave out the part that sits with you afterward. What sits with you, if you stay with the story long enough, is the silence after the war cry faded. The sea settled. The sun continued its movement across the sky as if it had never paused, and Athena stood there, fully formed, fully armed, completely herself, in the middle of a world that had been running for an eternity without her and had no particular obligation to make room. Every other being on Olympus had arrived differently. Hephaestus had been born and thrown from a height and had grown up knowing what it felt like to be discarded. Ares had been born and raised and had learned the way children learn things, through repetition and failure and the slow accumulation of experience. Even Zeus himself had spent his early existence hidden in a cave, nursed by a goat, listening to the sounds of a world he was not yet part of, wanting things he could not yet reach. They had all been small once. They had all needed something. Athena stepped out of her father's skull already knowing what she knew, already carrying what she carried, already the finished version of herself. There was no earlier version. There was no softer, younger, more uncertain Athena somewhere in the past that she had grown out of. There was only this, the woman in the helmet, looking out at everything with eyes that had never once seen anything and somehow already understood most of it. She was given a name. She was given a place on Olympus. She was given domains, wisdom, and the kind of warfare that requires thought rather than just fury, and craft, and the weaving of cloth, and the making of things that require both hands and intelligence to produce. These were not random assignments. They were recognitions. The gods looked at what had arrived in their midst and tried to find words for it. And these were the closest words they had. She moved into Olympus the way someone moves into a house that was already furnished. Everything was already there. The other gods, the hierarchy, The long, complicated history of relationships and grudges and alliances that had accumulated over eons of existence. She had not been present for any of it, and she did not need to be told about it, because she arrived already understanding how it worked. This made some of the other gods uncomfortable in a way they could not fully explain. It was not that she was threatening. She was not aggressive. Not in the way Ares was aggressive. Not in the way that put other people immediately on guard. She was simply present in a way that made you aware, without her saying anything about it, that she had already assessed the situation, already understood the relevant facts, already arrived at a position. You were not watching her figure something out. She had already figured it out. You were being shown the result. Hephaestus, who had split her father's skull and watched her emerge, observed her in the days after her arrival with the specific attention of someone who makes things and recognizes craftsmanship. He had made extraordinary objects. He had made the palaces of Olympus, the armor of heroes, the chains that held Prometheus to his rock. He understood what it looked like when something had been constructed with complete intentionality, when every element served the whole, when nothing was accidental. Athena looked like that. She moved like that. She was, in his professional assessment, the most precisely made thing he had ever seen. He kept this observation to himself, what the other gods learned about her in those early days, without her telling them, was a set of facts that would remain true about her for as long as stories about her were told. She did not want what they wanted, the things that occupied most of Olympus, love and rivalry, and the pleasures that gods pursued with the same compulsive energy that humans pursued them. These things were not interesting to her in the same way. She watched them with the attention of someone studying a subject, not participating in it. She understood desire without appearing to feel it. She understood grief without appearing to be vulnerable to it. What she cared about was different and harder to summarize. She cared about outcomes. She cared about whether things were built well or badly, whether plans were sound or foolish, whether the people she chose to involve herself with were using what they had in the best possible way. She was interested in excellence, the way a mathematician is interested in an elegant proof, not because of what it felt like to achieve it, but because excellence was the correct answer to the problem of existence. And correct answers mattered. This did not make her cold. That is the misunderstanding that follows her through every retelling. The assumption that someone who does not feel things the way others feel them must not feel anything at all. She felt things. She felt them with the same intensity she brought to everything else. But her feelings did not destabilize her. They did not surprise her. They did not arrive from outside her own understanding of herself and knock her sideways the way feelings knocked other gods sideways, the way they knocked humans sideways, the way they created all the problems that she would spend eternity helping people navigate. She had been made in the dark, inside fear, inside containment, inside a skull that was trying to prevent her existence. And she had come out of that not traumatized but tempered, the way metal comes out of a forge, harder than it went in, shaped by the pressure into something that would hold its form under conditions that would destroy softer things. There is a detail from the earliest accounts of her birth that does not appear in most modern retellings, and it is worth pausing on. When Athena emerged, fully armed, from Zeus's head, the gods of Olympus were frightened. Not all of them, and not for long. But in that first moment, before anyone had spoken or understood what they were looking at, the assembled gods of the Greek world felt fear. Think about who these gods were. Poseidon, who could split the earth and drown civilizations. Ares, who was made of warfare and could not be destroyed by it. Apollo, whose arrows crossed any distance without error. These were not beings who frightened easily, and a newborn made them stop. What they were reacting to was not the armor, though the armor was extraordinary. It was not the war cry, though the war cry was unlike anything they had heard before. It was something more fundamental, something that the image of a fully formed figure stepping out of a god's skull communicated without needing to be explained. She arrived knowing, in a world where knowledge was accumulated slowly, painfully, at great cost, where even the gods had needed time to understand their own natures and powers. She arrived already in possession of herself. That was frightening in the way that only things which violate the expected order of things are frightening, not because they are dangerous, but because they suggest that the rules you thought governed existence might not be as fixed as you believed. The fear passed quickly. She was Zeus's daughter. She was, visibly, on the side of order and intelligence rather than chaos. The other gods relaxed and made room for her, and Olympus adjusted itself around this new presence the way a room adjusts when someone remarkable walks in. But the moment had happened. It sat in the record of things that had occurred and could not be undone. She had been born from the head of the most powerful being in existence, inside the architecture of his fear, and she had come out of it not afraid, not damaged, not shaped by the experience of needing anyone. She had come out of it complete, and completeness, it turns out, is its own kind of isolation. Not the isolation of loneliness, not the isolation of rejection, but the isolation of a thing that was finished before it had any chance to be changed by the world it was entering. She would move through centuries and wars and cities and the lives of heroes and mortals and gods, and she would shape all of it, and none of it would shape her back. That is not a tragedy. She would not have called it a tragedy. It is simply what she was. Metis did not disappear. This is the part of the story that the most familiar versions tend to skip past, because it is uncomfortable in a way that is hard to address without saying something that sounds too modern, too pointed, too much like using an ancient story to make an argument the story did not originally intend. But the discomfort is there in the original material, sitting quietly in the background of every story about Athena, and skipping past it leaves the picture incomplete. Here is what the old sources say. After Zeus swallowed Metis, she continued to exist inside him. She was not destroyed. She was contained, which is a different thing. And she continued, from inside that containment, to do what she had always done, she thought. She counseled. She understood situations clearly and offered guidance. The wisdom of Metis did not stop being wisdom just because it was trapped inside the skull of the man who had swallowed her. It kept working. It kept being useful. It just could not leave. Zeus, by most accounts, benefited from this arrangement. The god who had been afraid of what Metis's intelligence might produce if it were free became, in the years following, notably wiser in his judgments, more measured, more capable of the long view, the careful calculation, the decision that sacrificed short-term advantage for long-term stability. Where did those qualities come from? The old stories do not make the connection explicit. They do not need to. The structure of what happened is clear enough. The most intelligent being in the ancient Greek cosmos was absorbed into the mind of the being who feared her most, and that being became, over time, smarter. Whether you call that benefit or theft or something in between depends on what you believe about the difference between knowledge and the person who carries it. Whether wisdom can be separated from its source. Whether intelligence that has been taken from someone is still intelligence, or whether it becomes something else entirely. These are not abstract questions. They are built into the foundation of Athena's existence. Because here is what follows from all of it. Athena was born from Zeus's head, but she was made, at least in part, from Meti, the armor Metis crafted in the darkness, the intentionality that shaped Athena's emergence, the quality of mind that Athena carried from her first moment in the world. These things did not come from nowhere. They came from a woman who had been swallowed, who was invisible, who would never be credited with what she had produced. The daughter who arrived in the world as the embodiment of wisdom, was, at some fundamental level, the child of wisdom that had been taken from someone else. This does not diminish Athena. It complicates her, and the complication is worth sitting with, because it is the kind of complication that the ancient Greeks understood and encoded into the story without resolving, which is a sign that they thought it mattered. There is something else to consider here, something quieter and harder to name. Athena and Metis never met. We take this for granted because the story makes it structurally impossible. Metis was inside Zeus before Athena was born, and Athena emerged from Zeus after Metis was already there. And at no point in any version of this story do mother and daughter occupy the same space in a way that would allow for anything resembling a relationship. The meeting that should have been the most natural thing in the world. The first thing, the thing that precedes everything else in a human life, never happened. And Athena, who arrived in the world already knowing most things, carried this gap in her knowledge. The way you carry a gap you cannot fully perceive because you have never experienced the thing that would fill it. She knew about mothers. She understood the concept completely. She could observe the relationships between the other gods and their parents, could watch Demeter and Persephone with the attention she brought to everything she studied, and understand what she was seeing. But she had never been held by someone who was afraid for her. She had never had the experience. So common, it seems almost too ordinary to mention, of being in the presence of someone who loved her before she had done anything to earn it, before she had demonstrated anything, before she had been wise or useful or extraordinary. The love that precedes knowledge of a person. The love that exists simply because the person exists and is yours. Zeus loved her. This is clear in the stories. He loved her with the pride of a father who recognizes his best qualities reflected and improved in a child. He gave her things. No other god received the aegis. His thunderbolt on some occasions. His confidence in ways he rarely expressed toward his other children. He trusted her judgment. He valued her counsel. But Zeus was also the man who had swallowed her mother. This fact existed in the architecture of their relationship, the way a crack exists in the foundation of a building, invisible from the surface. Load-bearing in ways you only discover when pressure is applied. Did Athena know this? Of course she knew. She arrived knowing most things. She would have understood what had been done, what it cost, what the arrangement was, what she could not have known, what no amount of intelligence could substitute for, was what it would have been like if it had gone differently, what it would have been like if Metis had been present, if there had been someone in Athena's existence who had loved her, not because of what she could do, but simply because she was there and she was Metis's daughter. The ancient Greeks encoded this gap into their goddess of wisdom and did not comment on it directly. They simply told the story and let it sit there. This foundational absence at the center of the most celebrated intelligence in their pantheon. There is one more thing worth noting before this chapter closes. The word for wisdom in ancient Greek is Sophia. It is a feminine noun. The Greeks gendered their abstractions, and they made wisdom a woman. The way they made justice a woman and memory a woman and the muses, who carried all human creative capacity. Women, when they built their civilization's most foundational concepts, they reached instinctively for the feminine, and then they told a story in which the most powerful male god in existence swallowed the woman who embodied wisdom, and the wisdom that survived was the wisdom that emerged from his head, carrying his name, serving his interests, shaped by the darkness of his containment. They told this story and built a 40-foot statue to the result, and called it the greatest temple in the world. What they were saying about the relationship between wisdom and power, between intelligence and the institutions that claim to represent it, is something each person who encounters this story has to work out for themselves. The question is not what happened to Metis. The question is what Athena carried, without knowing it, from the very beginning. There is a moment in the Iliad that most people who have read it remember, without knowing exactly why it stayed with them. The Greek and Trojan armies are facing each other across a field outside the walls of Troy. The battle is about to begin. The noise is already building. The kind of noise that a mass of armed men produces before violence actually starts, which is different from the noise of the violence itself, lower and more animal. The sound of thousands of people deciding simultaneously that they are willing to die today. On one side of this field stands Ares. He is enormous in the way gods are enormous when they choose to make themselves visible on a battlefield. Too large to be human, too present to be ignored. He is screaming, not commanding, not directing, not making tactical assessments about where the line is weakest or which flank needs reinforcement. Screaming with everything in him. The sound of it moves through the Trojan soldiers like a physical force, and some of them, veterans of years of this war, find themselves stepping back without deciding to. On the other side of the field stands a figure that every experienced soldier, on both sides, has learned to watch for above any other. She is not screaming. She is standing still, reading the field the way a person reads a map, taking in the whole of it at once, her attention moving from point to point with the efficiency of someone who has already done the calculation and is now confirming the result. This is Athena, two gods of war, standing on opposite sides of the same battle, and every experienced soldier present understands that these are not two versions of the same thing. They are two entirely different understandings of what war is. Ares believes war is the point, the violence itself, the collision of bodies and iron and will, is what he exists for. He does not want to win so that the war can end. He wants the war to continue because the war is where he is most fully himself, where his nature finds its proper expression, where the world is arranged in the way that suits him best. He is intoxicated by it. Always. He has been intoxicated by it since before the first human being ever picked up a rock and hit another human being with it. And he will be intoxicated by it long after the last one puts down whatever weapon comes last. Athena believes war is a problem to be solved, not a permanent condition, not a way of life, not the truest expression of anything noble in the nature of those who practice it. A problem, expensive, destructive, full of irreversible consequences, and occasionally necessary. She approaches it the way a surgeon approaches a patient who requires an operation with precision, with the understanding that every cut costs something, with the goal of finishing as quickly and cleanly as possible and getting the patient to a condition where no further cutting is required. She is very good at it, better, in the accounting of outcomes, than Ares has ever been. This is the fact that the Iliad documents without quite announcing across the span of the Trojan War. Every time Ares and Athena come into direct opposition, Athena wins. She defeats him in argument. She defeats him on the battlefield. There is a scene, remarkable in its directness, where Athena physically knocks Ares down, and the god of war, the being who is made of violence, gets up covered in dust and walks away. He walks away because she outmaneuvered him, not because she hit harder, because she read the situation and chose her moment and was in the right position when it mattered, which is a different kind of strength entirely, and one that Ares, for all his power, has never fully understood. The Greek soldiers who had been on the field long enough to observe both of them had a clear preference. They feared Ares the way you fear weather vast, impersonal, entirely indifferent to what you deserve or do not deserve. They trusted Athena the way you trust a general who has looked at the same ground you are standing on and has a plan that accounts for the fact that you are standing on it. Fear and trust are not the same thing, and they produce different kinds of soldiers. There is a scene in the Iliad, in the 5th book, where Diomedes, one of the great Greek warriors of the Trojan War, has just been wounded. He is on the field, and he is bleeding, and he is doing the arithmetic that wounded soldiers do, calculating what he has left against what the situation still requires. Athena comes to him, She does not tell him the wound does not matter, or that glory awaits, or any of the things that Ares, standing on the Trojan side, has been shouting at everyone within hearing distance. She tells him something specific. She warns him not to fight the gods face to face. Then she identifies the one exception: if Aphrodite enters the battle, he can engage her. She lifts the fog from his eyes so he can see the gods moving on the field. Information no mortal soldier normally has. Later, when Ares himself dominates the field and the Greek line begins to break, Athena changes the terms entirely. She climbs into Diomedes' chariot beside him, and she makes the impossible possible. Diomedes wounds Ares, the god of war, struck by a mortal guided by a goddess, retreats from the field, screaming. This is how Athena operates in war, not by fighting for her soldiers, but by giving them what they cannot produce on their own, the right information at the right moment, the ability to see what is actually happening rather than what it looks like from ground level, and the specific adjustment that turns a breaking line into a held one. Ares, on the other side of the field, is still screaming. There are people who find Ares more honest than Athena, who feel that his refusal to dress violence up in the language of strategy and necessity is at least not a pretense. War is what it is, and Ares looks at it directly. Athena calls it a problem to be solved, but she is very good at solving it, which means she is very good at war, which means she is a goddess who has organized enormous amounts of violence in service of the outcomes she prefers. The difference between Ares and Athena, this argument goes, is not that one is violent and the other is not. They are both violent. The difference is that Athena has better reasons for her violence, which is a thing that every participant in every war in human history has also believed about themselves. This is a fair point. The stories do not resolve it. What the stories do make clear is this: the world that Ares produces, when he wins, is wreckage, fields of it, cities of it. The Iliad is, among other things, a very long documentation of what happens when Ares gets enough room to operate. And what happens is that everyone suffers, including the people he is nominally helping. The world that Athena produces, when she wins, is more complicated. It is not clean. It has its own wreckage, but it has, somewhere in it, the possibility of something built on the other side of the destruction. A city, a law, a technique for navigating monsters without looking at them directly. Whether that possibility justifies the cost of producing it is not a question Athena asks. She already knows what her answer is. Consider the object itself before considering what it means. The aegis appears differently across different centuries and different sources, which is itself a kind of information. Objects that people describe differently across generations are usually objects that people feel strongly about in ways that exceed what the object literally is. In some traditions it is a shield, large and round and fringed with serpents. In others, it is something worn over the shoulder, a mantle or a breastplate, something between armor and weapon and symbol, a made thing that resists being placed into a single category. What all the versions agree on is what it does. When Athena raises the aegis in battle, the effect on the people who see it is immediate and physical. Terror moves through an army the way fire moves through dry grass. Not the reasonable fear of someone who has assessed a dangerous situation and concluded that danger is present. Something older and more basic. The kind of fear that lives below thought, below the part of the mind that calculates and plans. In the older part, that simply responds to the signal that something is present which should not be approached. The Greeks had a word for this: deimos, panic in its ancient sense. The terror that has nothing to do with you personally, but with the presence of something that exceeds the human scale. The aegis produced it automatically, without effort, simply by being raised. This is the primary weapon of the goddess of wisdom. Her spear is there. Her intelligence is always there. But the first line of her defense, the thing she reaches for when she needs to protect something that matters to her, is an object that works by making people afraid. Sit with that for a moment, and then consider what is on the object. After Perseus kills Medusa, which is a story this account will come to shortly, he brings the head back and gives it to Athena. She places it on the aegis. And from that point forward, the face of the thing that Perseus killed with her guidance becomes part of the armor she wears into every subsequent encounter. The Gorgonian, the image of that face, appears in the ancient world, on doors, on qua, on temples, on pottery, on armor, on the breastplates of soldiers, on the lintels of houses. The Greeks put it everywhere they wanted protection. The face that killed with a single look became the face that protected everything beneath it. The goddess of wisdom protected herself and the things she cared about with the face of a woman. This is not incidental. The Greeks who told this story and painted this image and struck this face onto their currency were not making a decision carelessly. They were saying something about what protection looked like, about what it cost, about the relationship between wisdom and the darker materials it sometimes required. There is another layer to this that the sources encode without announcing. Athena was a virgin goddess. This is one of the most fundamental facts about her. She belonged to no one, was claimed by no one, was not defined by her relationship to any male figure. She had no husband, no lover, no children in the traditional sense. Her identity was entirely her own. In a mythological world where almost every female figure, mortal or divine, was understood partly through her relationship to men, Athena stood apart, and the primary image on her armor was the face of a woman whose story, in its most widely told form, began with a violation and ended with a transformation into something monstrous. Whether Medusa had been a monster from birth or a woman changed by what was done to her, the Gorgonian was female power, converted into an instrument, something that had originally been its own thing, with its own nature, had become a tool, worn by someone else, serving someone else's purposes. Athena wore it without apparent conflict. What does it mean that the most autonomous goddess in the Greek pantheon chose as her defining image the face of a woman whose autonomy had been completely eliminated? The sources do not ask this question explicitly, but the image is there, painted and sculpted and stamped into metal across the entire Mediterranean world for centuries, waiting for someone to look at it long enough to notice what it contains. Hephaestus watched her put the aegis on for the first time. He had watched a great many things in his long life as the maker of objects that mattered. He understood, better than most, that every object carried inside it the decisions that had gone into making it, the purpose it had been built for, the compromises and the choices and the specific understanding of the world that had produced its final form. He watched Athena fasten the Gorgonian to the aegis with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what she was doing and had decided to do it. She raised the shield. The terror moved out ahead of her like a wave. This is what protection costs. This is what it requires. Not because Athena is cruel or indifferent, but because the world she operates in does not offer the option of protection that does not have something dark at its center. You cannot guard a city with kindness alone. You cannot hold a line with good intentions. The face of something terrible is required, and someone must be willing to wear it. And Athena is the one who decided she was willing. Whether she was right to decide that is a question the aegis itself poses every time it appears. And the sources are very clear that it worked. Every army that saw it broke. Every enemy that faced it faltered. Every city that flew its image on its gates made the calculation that an enemy general makes when he sees something on the other side that he does not want to test. The protection was real. The cost of the protection was real. Both were true at the same time. The Greeks who built the Parthenon put the aegis on the statue of Athena inside it. 40 feet tall, visible from across the city, the goddess of wisdom wearing the terror on her chest, looking out over Athens with her owl-colored eyes. This is what they chose to put at the center of their civilization. This is what they looked at when they looked at wisdom. The city did not have a name yet. This is where the story begins. Before the Parthenon, before the democracy, before the philosophers and the playwrights and the generals whose decisions would be studied for the next 2,500 years, there was a hill, and around the hill there were people, and the people needed what all people in that part of the world needed: water, food, safety, a reason to stay in one place and build something that would outlast them. They also needed a god. This was not optional in the ancient world, the way it might seem optional now. A city without divine protection was a city without identity, without the particular flavor of luck and favor that came from having a powerful being invested in your survival. The gods were not abstract to the people who built their temples. They were practical. They were the difference between a drought that ended and a drought that did not, between a fleet that came home and a fleet that did not, between a city that lasted and a city that became a story other people told about what used to be there. So when two gods arrived on the hill above this unnamed settlement, both claiming the right to be its protector, the people gathered to watch understood that they were not witnessing a ceremony. They were witnessing the most consequential decision their community would ever make. Poseidon came first. He was the kind of presence that announces itself before it arrives. The ground trembled slightly as he approached, the way ground trembles near the ocean when the waves are large. A low, continuous vibration that you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. He was enormous and salt-weathered and ancient in the way that the sea is ancient, which is to say he was older than most of the things that thought they were old. He looked at the hill. He looked at the people on it. He raised his trident. What happened next was the kind of thing that people who were present would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe accurately to people who were not. The trident came down against the rock of the Acropolis, and, from that point of contact, water exploded upward. Not a trickle, not a seep, but a full eruption. Salt water shooting toward the sky and then cascading down the rock face and spreading across the ground at the feet of the assembled citizens. The sea, on a hill, miles from the actual sea. The people watching felt the spray on their faces and understood what was being offered. Poseidon ruled the Mediterranean. He ruled the trade routes and the fishing grounds and the winds that determined whether a ship came home or did not. He ruled the thing that connected the Greek world to every other world, the highway of water that made commerce and conquest and communication possible. To have Poseidon as your protector was to have the backing of everything that moved across water, which in the ancient Mediterranean meant almost everything that mattered. It was an extraordinary offer. Then Athena stepped forward. There was no trembling ground, no spray. She moved across the rock of the Acropolis with the focused quiet of someone who has already decided what she is going to do and is simply doing it now. She looked at the place she had chosen, and she knelt, and she placed her hand flat against the stone. What grew was slow, slower than the explosion of water, slower than anything a god might be expected to produce when trying to win a competition. A shoot, then a steam, then a branching, then leaves, silver-green and small, catching the light that came off the Aegean below. By the time it was finished, it was a tree, modest in size, unremarkable to look at if you did not know what you were looking at. An olive tree. The silence that followed was the silence of people doing rapid and complicated arithmetic. Poseidon's water was salt. This was the detail that everyone who was watching would have registered immediately, because the difference between salt water and fresh water was the difference between survival and its absence. The sea was powerful. The sea was transformative. The sea was the highway to everything. But you could not drink it, could not use it to water crops. could not use it for the 1,000 daily requirements of a settlement that wanted to become a city. The olive tree was something else entirely. Olives meant food. Olive oil meant light in darkness. Fuel for the lamps that made the hours after sunset habitable rather than simply endured. It meant medicine, because olive oil was used in every preparation that required a carrier. It meant wood for building and for burning. It meant trade, because olive oil was one of the most valuable commodities in the ancient Mediterranean, something that other cities needed and would pay for. One tree meant an orchard. An orchard meant an economy. An economy meant a city that could sustain itself through winters and droughts and sieges. The people of the unnamed city looked at a hole in the ground full of salt water and a small silver-green tree in the wind. And they chose the tree. Poseidon was furious. The sources vary on exactly how he expressed this fury, but they agree that he expressed it, and that the land around the city suffered for a while in ways connected to his displeasure. He was not a god who accepted being told no without consequence. The sea, when he was angry, made its anger felt by the people who lived near it, but the choice held. The city took the name of the goddess whose gift they had chosen, and Athena became the protector of Athens, and the olive tree she had planted became one of the most sacred objects in the Greek world, tended and protected for centuries. The physical proof of the day. The city made its decision. Here is what the story is really about. Underneath the contest and the gifts and the divine displeasure, the people of Athens were given a choice between two kinds of power. Poseidon offered them connection to the vast network of the Mediterranean world, the ability to move, to trade, to project force, to reach anywhere the water reached. It was outward-facing power, power that derived its value from expansion and movement. It was also power that was not theirs. The sea was Poseidon's, and favoring his worshippers was his choice to make or unmake. Athena offered them something they could grow themselves. This distinction mattered enormously to the people who told this story and to the people who heard it. The olive tree was not a gift that depended on continued divine goodwill. It was a technique, a knowledge, a capacity that once given could not be taken back. Athena did not offer Athens the sea. She offered Athens the ability to sustain itself on its own ground, to produce something valuable enough that the rest of the Mediterranean would come to them. She offered them the intelligence to not need what they could not control. This is the version of wisdom that Athena represents in this story, and that Athens chose when it chose her. Not the wisdom that tells you how to navigate the world as it is, but the wisdom that tells you how to make your part of the world into something that does not require navigation. Rootedness rather than movement, depth rather than reach, the long investment over the quick advantage. It is worth noting what Athens did with this choice over the following centuries. It built a navy. It built an empire. It projected force across the Mediterranean with an aggression that would have been very recognizable to Poseidon. The city that chose the olive tree and rootedness over the sea and expansion went on to become one of the most expansionist powers in the ancient Greek world. The stories we choose to tell about ourselves are not always accurate predictions of who we become, but the olive tree was real. It stood on the Acropolis for as long as the Acropolis stood. When the Persians burned the city in 480 BC, they burned the olive tree with it. When the Athenians came back to their ruined city after the Persians were driven out, they found the Acropolis in ash and rubble, and the sacred precinct of the olive tree scorched black. And from the charred stump, a single shoot was already growing. By the next day, it was a foot tall. The people of Athens took this as a sign. Their goddess had not abandoned them. The thing she had planted in their ground was not gone. It was doing what olive trees do when they are cut down or burned, growing back from the root. Slower than the first time, less dramatic than the original planting, but alive and continuing and entirely committed to the task of being a tree. Athena's first act as a patron was to plant something that could survive her absence. This says something about her that the more dramatic stories sometimes obscure. She was not interested in dependence. She was not interested in worshippers who needed her to be present in order to function. What she wanted, what her gift to Athens encoded, was capability, the capacity to persist without her, to root into the ground of your own existence and continue even when the conditions were terrible. The olive tree was not a symbol of her power. It was a symbol of what she wanted the people under her protection to become. The hero came to her without much to recommend him. He was young, the son of Zeus and a mortal woman named Danae, raised on the island of Seriphos without the training that sons of kings received, or the resources that made heroic undertakings survivable rather than simply suicidal. What he had was an impossible task, and no real idea how to accomplish it. The king of Seriphos, Polydect, wanted Danae. Perseus stood in the way of this. Polydectes solved the problem with the elegant simplicity of powerful men who need to remove obstacles without appearing to do so directly. He announced a banquet, required gifts of horses from all his guests, and when Perseus arrived without horses, accepted instead the young man's rash offer to bring back anything the king named. Polydectes named the head of Medusa. This was not a request. It was a disposal. Medusa was one of the 3 Gorgons, creatures so dangerous that looking at them directly caused immediate death, their gaze turning living flesh to stone. No one who had gone looking for Medusa had come back. The head of Medusa was something that did not exist as a thing a human being could possess, because the process of obtaining it was identical to the process of being destroyed. Perseus accepted the task because he was young and had made a public boast and could not take it back without losing the only thing a young man without resources has, which is his word. He left Seriphos with nothing but the problem and went looking for help in the way that people look for help when they do not know exactly where to find it, by going toward the thing and hoping that something useful presented itself along the way. What presented itself was Athena. She did not appear with fanfare. She appeared the way she usually appeared to people she had decided to assist, which is to say, she appeared in a way that felt almost coincidental until you thought about it later and realized it had not been coincidental at all. She was there, and then she was talking to Perseus, and by the time he had processed the fact that he was talking to a goddess, she was already several sentences into the information he needed. What she gave him first was not a weapon. It was an assessment. She told him the problem. Medusa's gaze was lethal because it was direct. The eyes of a Gorgon did not kill through any mystical transmission of power. They killed because looking at a Gorgon meant that your mind, confronted with what it was seeing, simply stopped. The encounter was too much. The nervous system recognized something it had no framework to process and resolved the problem by turning everything off. The solution, therefore, was not to be stronger than Medusa. It was to not look at her directly. Perseus received this information and then asked the obvious question, which was how exactly one was supposed to kill something one could not look at. Athena's answer is the detail that makes this story different from a story about a strong man killing a monster. She told him to use his shield as a mirror. This requires a moment to appreciate. The shield was polished bronze, worked until it showed a clear image of whatever was in front of it. The instruction was this: when you are near Medusa, you do not face her. You hold the shield up and you look at her reflection, and you use the reflection to guide your movements. You navigate by the image of the thing rather than the thing itself. You kill what you cannot look at by learning to see it indirectly. Perseus did this. He traveled to the edge of the world with the winged sandals of Hermes and the cap of invisibility borrowed from the nymphs. And when he found Medusa sleeping among her sisters, he approached, using his shield as his only source of visual information. He looked at her face only in reflection, never directly, guiding his sword by the mirror image of a creature that would have killed him instantly if he had simply raised his eyes. It worked. He brought the head back, and he brought it to Athena, and she placed it on her aegis. And that image, the face of what Perseus killed by learning not to look at directly, became the permanent mark of her protection. The story, at this level, is about the mechanics of a monster killing. At another level, it is about something more durable. Athena's contribution to Perseus's success was not strength. It was a method for handling things that are dangerous when confronted directly. She gave him a way to approach what could not be approached, to act against what could not be faced, by developing a technique for seeing it without looking at it. This is the quality she values above every other. Not courage. Exactly. Though courage is required. Not strength. Though strength is useful. The ability to develop a method for the thing that cannot be done by direct application of force. The capacity to step back from the problem and ask not, how do I attack this, but how do I see this clearly enough to act effectively? The heroes Athena helps share this quality. They are not the strongest. They are the ones who, when faced with something that resists direct confrontation, stop and think about the angle. There is something worth noting about what she did not give Perseus. She did not give him the power to look at Medusa directly and survive. She did not change him, upgrade him, make him into something that could handle the encounter on its own terms. The limitation remained. The Gorgon's gaze remained lethal. What she gave him was a way to operate within the limitation rather than a way to eliminate it. This is consistent across every story in which Athena helps a mortal. She does not make them invulnerable. She makes them more capable of using what they have. She gives them information, equipment, technique, the specific thing that allows their existing capacities to function in situations where those capacities would otherwise fail. She is interested in people operating at the level they are capable of, not in removing the difficulty that makes the operation meaningful. Perseus went into the cave where Medusa slept, carrying a mirror and a sword, and the method he had been given. And he used all three correctly. And he came out carrying something that every subsequent generation would recognize. But here is the part of the story that rarely receives the attention it deserves. When Perseus used the shield as a mirror, he was not just protecting himself from Medusa's gaze. He was seeing Medusa. He was the first person in any surviving account of the Gorgons who actually looked at one, who held an image of her face long enough to understand where she was and how she was positioned and what the angle required. Everyone before him had either avoided looking entirely and died confused, or had looked directly and died immediately. Perseus saw Medusa. He just saw her in reflection. And Athena, who had given him the mirror, took the face of the thing he had seen and wore it on her own armor from that point forward. The face that could not be looked at directly became the face of the goddess who taught you how to look at it. What she was saying with this, if the gesture means what it seems to mean, is something about the relationship between wisdom and the things that are hardest to face. Wisdom does not make those things safe to look at directly. It gives you a way to see them that does not destroy you. The reflection is not the same as the thing, but it has always been enough. Walk into any major museum in the world that has a collection of ancient Greek artifacts and find the room with the pottery. Look at the vessels, the black figures on orange clay, the orange figures on black, the careful lines of painters who worked on curved surfaces with brushes made from single hairs and produced images that have survived 2,500 years of burial and excavation and handling. Look at the faces painted on the vessels' necks, or stamped onto their handles, or worked into the decoration around their bases. You will find her everywhere. Wide eyes, frontally facing, which is unusual in Greek art where figures are almost always shown in profile, mouth open, serpents in the hair, or forming a belt, or coiling at the shoulders, the expression caught between a scream and a threat, between suffering and power, between the face of something dying and the face of something that cannot be killed. This is the Gorgonian, the image of Medusa's face, and it is one of the most reproduced images in the ancient world. The Greeks put it on doors to ward off evil. They put it on coins so that it traveled with their commerce across the Mediterranean. They put it on armor so that their enemies would feel, before the fighting began, something they could not entirely explain. They put it on the chest of their goddess of wisdom and carried it into every battle she oversaw. Before we talk about what happened to Medusa, it is worth sitting with the fact of how thoroughly her face saturated the visual world of the people who told her story. They were afraid of her, and they could not stop looking at her, which is not a contradiction. It is a very old and very human response to the things that frighten us most. The oldest versions of the Medusa story are spare. Hesiod, writing in the 8th century BC, gives us the basic structure. Medusa is one of 3 Gorgon sisters, daughters of ancient sea deities named Phorcys and Ceto. 2 of the sisters, Steno and Euryale, are immortal. Medusa is the mortal one, the vulnerable one, the one who can be killed. She lives with her sisters at the edge of the world, beyond the ocean, in the place where the sun goes when it is not illuminating the known world. In this version, she is what she is from the beginning. There is no before, no transformation, no story of what she was prior to being a monster. She simply is a monster, the mortal monster among immortal monsters, waiting at the edge of the world for Perseus to arrive. This version of Medusa has a particular quality to it. She is elemental, existing outside the categories of deserving and not deserving that later stories impose on her. She is not being punished. She is not a warning. She is simply a dangerous thing at the edge of the world. The way that deep water is a dangerous thing. The way that lightning is a dangerous thing. Not because it chose to be dangerous, but because that is what it is. Perseus kills her. That is what the story requires. From the blood that falls from the severed neck, 2 things are born, the winged horse Pegasus and the giant Chrysaor, things of beauty and power, emerging from the death of the thing that contained them. This is the version closest to the oldest sources. It is not the version most people in the modern world know. The version most people know comes from Ovid. Publius Ovidius Naso was a Roman poet writing in the 1st century BC, roughly 700 years after Hesiod. He was brilliant, sophisticated, interested in transformation as a theme in ways that went well beyond the literal metamorphoses, his most famous work catalogues. He was also writing in a different world with different concerns and a different relationship to the Greek material he was working with. In Ovid's telling, in the Metamorphose, Medusa was once a woman of remarkable beauty. Her hair, specifically, was celebrated. People stopped to look at her because of it. Poseidon saw her, and wanted her, and took her. In the temple of Minerva, which is the Roman name for Athena, Minerva, Ovid writes, turned away and covered her eyes with her shield, because the act was profaning her temple. And then, because the goddess could not punish Poseidon, she punished Medusa. She turned the hair that had attracted attention into serpents. She made the face that had been beautiful into the face that would turn people to stone. The woman became the monster as consequence of being violated in a goddess's own sacred space. This version traveled. It traveled through centuries of literary tradition and into the modern world and became, for a large portion of the people who encountered the Medusa story in the 20th and 21st centuries, the version. It is the one that inspired a sculpture by Luciano Garbati in 2008, a work showing Medusa holding the head of Perseus, the original monster reclaimed as the one who was wronged, installed across from the courthouse in New York, where a famous abuse case was tried 2021. It is also a Roman version, written 7 centuries after the earliest Greek sources. by a poet whose interest in the psychological dimensions of myth was as sophisticated as anyone who has written about myth before or since. Both things are true at the same time. Here is what the coexistence of these versions tells us. And this matters more than the question of which version is correct. Because the question of which version is correct has no clean answer. Stories change because the people telling them need different things from them. The early Greeks needed Medusa to be a monster because they needed the story of Perseus to be a story about a hero overcoming something genuinely dangerous. The monster has to be a monster for the hero's achievement to mean anything. The Gorgonian had to be terrifying because it was being used as a protective image. And a protective image derives its power from the credibility of the threat it represents. The later need. The need that Ovid's version serves and that the modern reclamation of Medusa continues to serve, is different. It is the need to find, inside the figure of the monster, the human being who was there before the monstrousness, to ask not just what the monster is but how it came to be, to hold the powerful accountable for the things that happen in their shadow, in their temples, in the places that are supposed to be protected. Both needs are real. Both versions serve them. What neither version fully addresses is Athena's position in all of it. In the oldest version, she gives Perseus the tools, and he kills Medusa, and she takes the head and wears it. In Ovid's version, she witnesses something terrible in her own temple, and responds to it by transforming the person who was wronged. In both versions, she ends up with Medusa's face on her armor. In the oldest version, the face is a trophy, the proof of a monster destroyed. In Ovid's version, the face is something more uncomfortable, the permanent, visible reminder of a woman the goddess was present for and did not protect, worn into every subsequent battle. What does she see when she looks at her own shield? The sources do not answer this. They give us the image over and over, the goddess of wisdom, with the face of the Gorgon pressed against her chest. They reproduce it on pottery and sculpture and coins and temple decorations. They make it one of the most recognizable visual combinations in the ancient world. And they do not tell us what Athena thinks about it. Maybe that silence is the point. Maybe the image is designed to carry the question rather than answer it, to show you something that does not resolve, that holds contradictions without collapsing them, that allows the face of the monster and the face of the woman and the face of the victim and the face of the weapon to all be the same face simultaneously. The Gorgonian, at its most fundamental level, is a face that cannot be looked at directly, which is why it ended up on the shield of the goddess who taught Perseus to look at things indirectly. She understood something about this face that the simple versions of the story do not quite capture, that there are things in the world that you cannot approach frontally, cannot resolve by looking at them straight on, cannot simplify into monster or victim or weapon or memorial without losing something essential, that some things require the mirror, that some faces contain too much to be looked at directly. She put that face on her chest and wore it everywhere. Whether that was wisdom or something more complicated is a question that 2,500 years of storytelling has not finished asking. It is still asking now. There is a scene near the beginning of the Odyssey that is easy to read past if you are moving quickly through the poem, looking for the parts with monsters and gods and storms at sea. Telemachus is sitting in his own home, which does not feel like his own home anymore. He is 18 years old. His father has been gone for 20 years, 10 at Troy and 10 somewhere on the ocean between Troy and home. And the official position on whether Odysseus is alive or dead is undecided. And the men courting his mother, Penelope, are using that undecidedness as cover for an extended occupation of a house that is not theirs. They eat his father's food. They drink his father's wine. They treat his mother like an asset to be acquired and him like an inconvenience to be managed. Telemachus sits in the hall every evening watching all of this and feeling the specific weight of a person who understands exactly what is happening and does not yet have what it takes to stop it. He is not stupid. He is not weak. He is simply not yet the person the situation requires. And he knows it. And the knowing makes it worse. On this particular evening, a stranger appears at the door, old, carrying a spear, wearing the kind of road-worn clothing that belongs to someone who has been traveling for a long time. The rules of hospitality in the ancient Greek world were absolute. You welcomed the stranger before you asked who they were. Telemachus goes to the door himself, leads the stranger away from the noise of the suitors, seats him, provides food and drink. They talk. The stranger asks about the men in the hall. Telemachus explains, with the flat precision of someone who has described an unbearable situation so many times, it has become almost routine. His father gone, his mother besieged, himself not powerful enough yet to do what needs to be done. The stranger listens all the way to the end, without interrupting. Then the stranger begins to talk. And what follows is not a speech about courage or destiny or the greatness that awaits. It is something more specific and more useful. The stranger tells Telemachus to call a public assembly the next morning, to speak before witnesses about what is happening in his house, to take the first step toward action that does not require him to already have the power he does not yet have. Then the stranger tells him to go find information about his father, to sail to the mainland, to visit the old men who fought at Troy, to ask what they know, not to wait for news to come to him, but to go toward it. Telemachus listens to all of this. He is not transformed by it. He does not suddenly become brave. He is a young man who has just been given a workable plan by someone who assessed his situation accurately and told him the truth about it in terms he could act on. The stranger stands to leave and transforms, briefly, into a bird, and is gone. Telemachus goes back to the hall. He sits among the suitors, but the quality of his sitting has changed. He is not enduring anymore. He is planning. And the difference between enduring and planning, for a person who has been doing nothing but endure, is the difference between a river that has been dammed and a river that has found a crack. He speaks at the assembly the next morning. He sails to the mainland. He comes back changed in the way that only movement changes people, with information and with the knowledge that he is capable of going toward the problem instead of waiting for the problem to resolve itself. The stranger was Athena. She had been in his house, disguised as an old man with a spear, and she had sat across from him and talked with him about his life. And at no point during the conversation had she told him who she was. She had given him exactly what he needed, as a person rather than as a divine intervention, in the lamb form of a conversation rather than a miracle. And then she had left. This is her operating mode, and it is one of the most distinctive things about her in the entire Greek mythological tradition. She disguises herself constantly. She appears as old men and young women and strangers and companions and voices and figures glimpsed at a distance. She speaks through people, guides through situations, intervenes through the arrangement of circumstances rather than through the direct application of divine power. When she does appear as herself, which she does, you realize in retrospect that the influence you felt earlier in the story, the subtle shift in a situation that seemed accidental, had her fingerprints on it. The question worth asking is why. She is a goddess. She could appear in her full nature. She could tell Telemachus at the door, "I am Athena, and I have a plan for you." And here it is. She could save the time and the indirection and simply be what she is. She chooses not to. There are practical reasons for this. Gods, operating openly in the human world, creates problems, attracts attention from other gods with competing interests, introduces variables that make outcomes harder to control. But there is something else happening here that goes beyond tactics. When Athena appears as a stranger and tells Telemachus what to do, he makes the decision to follow the advice. He is not compelled. He is not blessed with sudden courage or gifted with power he did not have before. He is a young man who heard a reasonable assessment of his situation from someone who seemed to understand it, and decided the advice was good, and acted on it. The agency is his. If Athena had appeared as herself, nobody argues with a goddess standing in their doorway. The choice would have been removed. The transformation of Telemachus from passive observer to active participant in his own story is not something she does to him. It is something he does, using what she gave him. This matters to her in a way that goes beyond any individual case. The heroes she helps, across the full breadth of stories she appears in, share a specific characteristic they have to use what they are given. Perseus cannot delegate the mirror. Odysseus cannot outsource the patience required to make it home. Telemachus has to stand up in the assembly himself and say the words himself and face the suitors with his own face and his own voice. Athena can arrange the conditions. She cannot perform the action. She does not want to perform the action. This is the distinction that separates her from the gods who simply solve problems for their favorites. She is interested in people becoming capable, not in people being rescued. The rescue, when it comes as a byproduct of the person having developed into someone who can almost rescue themselves. Almost. That word matters. She does not make them fully independent. She makes them almost independent, which is the closest a mortal can get to independence in a world where gods are moving through events the way weather moves through a landscape, invisibly shaping everything, and visible only in the effects. She sat across from a frightened boy in his occupied house, and she talked to him until he decided to become the person the situation required. Then she turned into a bird and left. She has always been better at giving people what they need than at staying long enough to see what they do with it. There is something almost painful about this. When you hold all the stories together, she enters lives at the moment of greatest need. She gives the specific thing that changes the trajectory. And then she goes, because there is always somewhere else. Always another person at the edge of what they can handle. Always another door she can knock on in another form, and another conversation she can have that will move something forward. Telemachus sailed the next morning, before the suitors knew what he was doing. He stood on the deck and watched the island of his childhood get smaller behind him. And somewhere in the motion of that departure, in the physical fact of going toward the thing instead of waiting for it, he began to become who he needed to be. He did not know who had talked to him the night before. He did not need to know. That was the whole point. The war had been over for 10 years, and Odysseus was still not home. This fact requires a moment to absorb, because it is easy to let the number slide past without feeling its weight. 10 years at Troy, watching men die for a cause that had long since stopped being about the thing it was originally about, and had become instead about the accumulated investment of a decade. The sunk cost of all that blood making it impossible to simply stop. And then 10 more years on the water, on icelands, in caves, in the beds of goddesses who were not his wife, on a raft in open ocean, on the shore of a country he did not recognize, making his way toward a home he was no longer certain was waiting for him. 20 years. A son who was an infant when he left and was now a young man sitting in a hall full of strangers. A wife who had kept a kingdom running alone, while everyone around her tried to convince her that the man she was keeping it for was dead. Athena had been watching all of it. She had not been able to help during the 10 years of ocean. This is one of the most remarkable admissions in the Odyssey, and it appears quietly enough that it is easy to miss. Poseidon was angry with Odysseus, furiously and personally angry, because Odysseus had blinded Poseidon's son, Polyphemus the Cyclops, and then had been unwise enough to shout his real name into the wind as he sailed away, making sure the blinded monster knew exactly who to blame. Poseidon had taken this seriously. He had made the ocean between Troy and Ithaca into a sustained argument against Odysseus's survival, and Athena, for 10 years, had not been able to intervene. The Olympian gods were not above politics. They were, in many ways, entirely made of politics, a hierarchy of relationships and debts and obligations and competing claims that constrained what any individual god could do regardless of what they wanted to do. Athena wanted to bring Odysseus home. Poseidon wanted to prevent it. And for a decade, Poseidon's claim was strong enough that she had to watch from a distance, while the man she favored above all other mortals was thrown around the Mediterranean by a god who had a better grievance in the short term. Think about what that decade looked like from her side. She is a goddess of action, of purposeful intervention, of the arranged circumstance and the well-timed disguise and the specific piece of information that changes everything. She is constitutionally incapable of doing nothing. And for 10 years she did nothing, because the balance of divine authority would not permit her to do otherwise. She waited. She waited the way someone waits when they are very good at patience and hate every minute of it. When the Odyssey begins, the balance has shifted. Zeus, persuaded by Athena's arguments in the divine council, agrees that enough is enough. Poseidon's anger has had its time. The scales tip, and the opening for intervention appears, and Athena moves into it immediately, without hesitation, with the focused urgency of someone who has been waiting a very long time for a door to open and is through it before it finishes swinging. She goes to Telemachus first, as we have already seen. Then she goes to where Odysseus is, the island of the nymph Calypso, where he has been stranded for 7 years, offered immortality and comfort and the love of a divine being, sitting on the shore every day, looking at the water and weeping because none of it is Ithaca. And here is where the Odyssey does something that most heroic epics do not do. It shows us Athena operating in the dark. She cannot simply appear beside Odysseus on Calypso's island and say, "She is back, and here is the plan." Poseidon is still out there, still capable of making the ocean into a weapon, still waiting for exactly that kind of divine overreach to justify another decade of interference. She has to move carefully, through the spaces that the balance of divine politics allows her, getting Odysseus off the island and into the water before Poseidon knows what is happening. She does this through Hermes, through messages, through the slow machinery of divine authority being brought to bear on a problem that requires patience. She does not feel. She does what she has always done. She works through the available channels, uses the structures as they exist, and finds the path that accomplishes the goal within the constraints of the situation. This is not the inspiring version of Athena. This is the version that shows up at 3 in the morning when the inspiring version is not available, and does the unglamorous work of getting something done in a world that is not cooperating. When Odysseus finally reaches Ithaca, Athena reveals herself to him. She has been working indirectly up to this point, as she usually does. But now she drops the disguise, and they stand together on the shore of his home island and talk to each other as something closer to equals than most gods and mortals ever manage. The conversation is extraordinary because of what both of them say. Odysseus, who has been living on disguise and misdirection and the strategic management of other people's perceptions for 20 years, does not immediately trust even a goddess. He is cautious. He is a man who has survived by being cautious, by treating every situation as potentially a trap, by withholding commitment until he has information he does not yet have. He talks to her carefully, feeling out the conversation, waiting to understand what she is and what she wants. Athena finds this delightful. She is pleased by his caution. She is not offended by his reluctance to simply believe her. She looks at this man who has survived 20 years of catastrophe by trusting nothing he has not tested, and she recognizes something. She tells him they are both known for this, for strategy, for understanding the gap between what appears to be true and what actually is, for being able to hold the knowledge of what they want while presenting something else entirely to the world around them. This is as close as Athena comes, in any surviving text, to saying directly that she has chosen Odysseus because he is like her. not because he is the strongest, not because he is the most virtuous, not because his cause is the most just or his suffering the most deserving of relief, but because the way his mind works, the particular shape of his intelligence, the specific skills he has developed for operating in a world where direct confrontation is rarely the best option, resembles something in her own nature that she recognizes and values. She sees herself in him, and she helps him get home. This is a different kind of divine patronage than most of the Greek heroes receive. Achilles had his mother Thetis, whose love for him was the unconditional love of a parent, the love that has nothing to do with merit and everything to do with simple existence. Athena's relationship with Odysseus is about what the hero thinks, how he processes information, what he does with ambiguity, how he behaves when direct action is impossible and patience is the only tool available. She is interested in his mind the way a master is interested in a student who has independently arrived at the same conclusions. There is a particular pleasure in finding someone who got there themselves, who did not need to be taught, but who somehow learned. She lies to him. This needs to be acknowledged directly. She appears to him in disguises. She manages information. She arranges situations without telling him what she has arranged. Some of what he believes is his own achievement has her fingerprints on it in ways he is not fully aware of. He does the same to her, or tries to. He deflects and misdirects and presents himself as other than what he is, until she points this out, and they both, apparently, find the symmetry worth something close to amusement. Their relationship is built on the shared understanding that truth is a thing you deploy strategically rather than offer freely, that the world is full of situations where the direct presentation of who you are and what you want would be counterproductive. That intelligence includes knowing when to be honest, and when honesty is a luxury you cannot currently afford. This is not an ethic that makes everyone comfortable. Odysseus was the most controversial hero in the Greek tradition, admired in some texts and condemned in others, celebrated for his intelligence and resented for the uses he put it to. Ajax, the straightforward warrior who fought and died without misdirection, had his own tradition of being preferred over Odysseus by people who found Odysseus's methods distasteful. Athena's sustained preference for Odysseus over heroes of Ajax's type says something about what she actually values versus what she is officially supposed to represent. The goddess of wisdom, when she picks her favorite mortal, does not pick the most honest one. She picks the most adaptable one, the one who can become what the situation requires, the one who has learned, through 20 years of situations that would have destroyed a less flexible person, that survival and success in a complicated world require a willingness to operate in that world as it is, rather than as it should be. This is wisdom of a particular kind. Practical, unsentimental, deeply effective, and not always comfortable to spend time with. It is her kind. She brought him home. After 20 years, after everything the ocean and the gods and his own decisions had done to him, she arranged the final approach. She disguised him as a beggar so he could walk into his own house unrecognized. She held back the dawn, in one version of the story, so that he and Penelope had enough time for the reunion that 20 years had been building toward. She gave back the 20 years as much as 20 years can ever be given back, which is not completely, which is never completely, but more than most people get, and then the Odyssey ends, and Athena moves on to whatever she moved on to next, and Odysseus has his home, and his wife, and his son, and the accumulated weight of 2 decades of surviving things that should have killed him. She gave him 20 years of her attention and a path home. What he gave her in return, what anyone she helped gave her in return, was the opportunity to watch them succeed. Whether that was enough is a question she would not have answered. She was too intelligent to answer a question whose answer she could not use. If it was not enough, there was nothing to be done about it. Because her nature was her nature, and she had known that since the first moment of her existence, she was already somewhere else. She was always already somewhere else. Here is what is true about the Trojan War before any of the stories about it begin. Helen did not cause it. This sounds wrong because the tradition is so insistent on the opposite, so committed to the image of a single beautiful woman as the sufficient explanation for 10 years of organized slaughter, that questioning it feels like arguing with something foundational. But the Trojan War, like all wars, had causes that preceded and exceeded its immediate occasion. The immediate occasion was the departure of Helen from Sparta to Troy with a Trojan prince named Paris. The actual causes were older and more structural, the accumulation of Greek military power looking for a target, the wealth of Troy sitting at the mouth of the trade routes to the Black Sea, the tangled web of oaths and obligations that meant, when Menelaus called for help, every Greek king who had competed for Helen's hand was technically bound to provide it. The face that launched 1,000 ships was real, but the ships had been looking for somewhere to go before the face gave them a direction. The gods knew this. They had their own reasons for the war that had nothing to do with Helen's beauty, or Paris's desire, or Menelaus's wounded pride. The divine architecture of the Trojan War was built on a contest that 3 goddesses had entered, judged by a mortal man, with consequences that none of them had fully calculated. The contest was between Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. The prize was a golden apple. The judge was Paris. Each goddess offered him something in exchange for being chosen. Hera offered power, kingship, dominion, the kind of authority that reshapes the world around the person who holds it. Athena offered skill, victory in battle, wisdom in war, the qualities that make a man genuinely formidable rather than simply impressive. Aphrodite offered him the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris chose Aphrodite. What followed, from the perspective of the 2 goddesses who lost, was personal. Hera and Athena did not reassess their offer, did not conclude that perhaps power and skill were less appealing than they thought, did not take the judgment in the spirit of democratic competition. They were furious in the specific and sustained way of beings who have very long memories and no mechanism for letting things go. They supported the Greeks because the Greeks were fighting Troy, and Troy was the city of the man who had passed them over, and they wanted it to burn. Athena, goddess of wisdom, went to war over a beauty contest. She lost. This is worth sitting with, not because it diminishes her, but because it is one of the most honest things about her in all the surviving material. She is not transcendent. She is not above the logic of wounded pride and the desire for redress that motivates the rest of the divine world. She is extremely intelligent, and she is capable of sustained strategic thinking, and she is also, underneath all of that, a being who remembers being passed over and does not forgive it. Her support for the Greeks was real and effective, and she poured herself into it with everything she had. She stood on the Greek side of battlefields and guided their best warriors. She intervened at critical moments to prevent defeats that would have ended the war prematurely. She was a constant, shaping presence in 10 years of conflict. She also lied to Hector. This is the moment in the Iliad that most clearly reveals the full complexity of what Athena's support meant. Hector, the greatest Trojan warrior, the man who had held Troy's defense together through a decade of siege. He had reached the point the Iliad had been building toward. He was alone outside the walls, facing Achilles, and he had made the decision to stand and fight rather than run. It was the wrong decision tactically, and some part of him knew it, but he had made it, and he was committed to it. And there was a version of this moment that could have been simply what it appeared to be 2 great warriors, one on each side of the most famous war in Greek memory, meeting each other on open ground. Athena appeared to Hector, disguised as his brother, Deiphobus. She appeared beside him and told him he was not alone, that his brother had come out to fight alongside him, that the fight would be 2 against 1. Hector believed her, He stood his ground with the confidence of a man who believes he has support that he does not have. When the moment came that he needed his brother beside him, there was no one there. Deiphobus was inside the walls. He had never come out. What Hector had seen was Athena in disguise, manufacturing the courage Hector needed to stay in a fight she needed him to lose. He died because Achilles was the better fighter, and the better fighter won. But he also died because the goddess of wisdom told him a lie at the moment when the truth might have sent him back through the gates. She did this with the focused efficiency she brought to everything she did on behalf of the Greeks. She did it, and the Iliad records it without editorial comment, without suggesting that it was wrong or right, without offering any frame other than the sequence of events itself. The reader is left to supply their own response. Here is a useful one. Athena, in the space of this war, both intervened to stop Achilles from killing Agamemnon in a moment of rage, pulling him back from an act that would have destroyed the Greek coalition, and arranged the death of Hector through deception. She restrained violence she judged counterproductive, and enabled violence she judged necessary. She made these decisions from a position of strategic assessment, of seeing the whole board, of knowing which outcome the larger goal required. Whether that constitutes wisdom or something colder that merely resembles it is the question the Trojan War raises about her that the Trojan War does not answer. There is one more thing. After Troy fell, the Greeks sacked the city with a completeness that shocked even the gods who had wanted the city to fall. They committed acts inside its temples, against its people, against the sacred obligations that were supposed to govern even victory, that violated the structures that Athena herself represented, the structures of limit, of law, of the difference between winning and simply destroying. Athena, who had been the Greeks' most devoted divine supporter throughout the entire war, turned on them. She went to Poseidon, her old rival for Athens, the god she had defeated in the contest for the city's patronage, and she asked for his help, sending the Greek fleet to the bottom of the sea. Poseidon, who had spent 10 years opposing the Greeks, agreed immediately. The storms that followed killed more Greeks on their way home from Troy than had died in all the years of fighting. Athena had supported the Greeks completely and punished them comprehensively when they violated the principles she had been fighting for. She was not on the side of the Greeks. She had never been on the side of the Greeks. She was on the side of what the Greeks were supposed to represent. When they stopped representing it, she stopped being on their side. This is a consistency of a particular kind. Cold, demanding, entirely serious about the values it enforces. The kind of consistency that does not care about loyalty when loyalty conflicts with principle. The kind of consistency that makes an extraordinary patron and a dangerous one. The Trojans knew both of those things. The Greeks learned the second one on the way home. There is a village in Lydia, in the western part of what is now Turkey, where a girl grew up knowing she was extraordinary. Her name was Arachne. Her father was a dyer of wool, a man whose hands were permanently stained, the colors he worked with, purple and red, and the deep blue that came from certain shellfish along the coast. It was not a prestigious occupation. It was skilled work, necessary work, the kind of work that made other work possible. But it occupied a place in the social hierarchy of the ancient world that was comfortable at best and invisible at worst. Arachne was not invisible. She had learned to weave the way some people learn to do the thing they were built for, not through instruction so much as through contact with the materials themselves, the loom and the thread, recognizing something in her hands that other hands did not have. By the time she was known beyond her village, and she became known beyond her village while she was still young, people came distances to watch her work, not just to see the finished product, to watch the process, the way her fingers moved, the speed that looked impossible until you had watched it long enough to understand that it was simply what the speed of complete mastery looks like, which is different from the speed of effort in the way that a river is different from a man running. She was not working hard. She was doing what she had been made to do. And the cloth that came off her loom was the proof of it. What she produced was not ordinary weaving. Ordinary weaving, in the ancient world, meant functional cloth, straight lines, simple patterns, the craft in service of the product. What Arachne produced was something that used the structure of cloth as a medium for images, pictures built from thread, scenes that resolve themselves as you step back from the loom, the way a mosaic resolves into a face when you stop looking at the individual tiles. She wove stories, and the stories she chose to weave were not the stories that decorated the pottery and the walls of wealthy houses. The clean mythological images, the gods in their power, the heroes in their glory. She wove the gods doing the things the gods actually did, which were frequently things the gods did not want, rendered in permanent textile form and displayed for the appreciation of a public audience. She wove Zeus, not the majestic Zeus of the temple friezes, seated on his throne with his eagle and his thunderbolt, radiating divine authority. She wove Zeus in the middle of his transformations, the bull approaching Europa, the swan descending toward Leda, the shower of gold entering the tower where Danae was imprisoned. Every story in which the most powerful god in the cosmos had used that power to take something that was not freely given. She wove Poseidon. She wove Apollo. She wove the catalogue of divine behavior that the ancient Greeks knew and told and preserved, and that the gods themselves did not like having presented without the framing that made it acceptable. The framing that said these were the necessary actions of necessary beings. That power of this magnitude operated by different rules. Arachne removed the framing. She wove the events themselves. The skill with which she did this was undeniable. The images were perfectly executed. The technique was flawless. A person looking at her work would have had to work very hard to find anything to criticize in the craft, because there was nothing to criticize in the craft. It was extraordinary. This was the problem. Athena heard about Arachne. She had heard about craftspeople before. She was the goddess of craft as well as wisdom and war, the patron of the skilled making of things, and exceptional makers came to her attention the way exceptional warriors did, as examples of human capacity pushed to its edge. She was interested in human capacity at its edge. She had always been interested in that. What she heard about Arachne included the weaving, but it also included something else. Arachne, when asked about her skill, about where it came from, about who had taught her, made a claim that was not unusual for a young person at the peak of their abilities, and not yet fully acquainted with the costs of saying certain things out loud. She said that no one had taught her. She said the skill was her own. She said that if Athena herself wanted to dispute this, Athena should come and they would see. This is the kind of statement that travels. In a world where the gods were listening, it was almost certain to produce consequences. Athena came. She came in disguise first, as an old woman, bent and slow, the kind of figure that attracted a certain protective condescension from young people who believed that age and diminishment were the same thing. She went to Arachne and offered the advice that experience offers to talent that has not yet been tested by something larger than itself. She suggested, gently, that there was a difference between exceptional human skill and divine skill, and that it might be wise to acknowledge that difference before the comparison was made in terms that could not be walked back. Arachne was not interested in gentle. She told the old woman that the advice was unnecessary. She repeated her claim. She said she was not afraid of the comparison, and she was not going to soften the challenge to make anyone more comfortable. The old woman straightened. The workshop went still with the specific stillness of a space where something has arrived that changes the weight of everything in it. The women watching stepped back. The light shifted in the way that light shifts when something not entirely natural is present. Arachne did not step back. This is the detail the story hinges on. Every other mortal in the surviving accounts of divine confrontations steps back, not from cowardice, but from the recognition that arrives in the body before the mind can intervene. The body knows when something exceeds its category. The body responds. Arachne's body did not respond that way. Or if it did, she overrode it. She looked at the goddess of wisdom standing in her workshop, and she held her ground. The contest began. They each took a loom. Athena wove the story of her contest with Poseidon for Athens, the two gods on the Acropolis, the salt spring, the olive tree, the assembled people choosing. She wove it with the composition of someone who understood exactly what the image needed to communicate the dignity of divine power deployed in service of civilization. The moment when wisdom offered itself to the human world, and the human world accepted. In the corners of her work, she placed images of mortals who had challenged gods and suffered for it. Small cautionary figures at the margins. A frame within which the central image could be read. She was sending a message. She sent it with the skill of someone who had been sending messages through images for as long as images had existed. Arachne wove the gods, doing what the gods actually did. She wove it perfectly. Ovid, who tells this story in the Metamorphoses, and tells it better than anyone before or since, is precise about what happened when Athena looked at Arachne's finished work. He does not say she found a flaw. He does not say the work was inferior. He says Athena could not find a single thing wrong with it. Then she destroyed it. She struck the loom. She tore the cloth. The perfect images. The true images. The images that had been executed with a skill that the goddess of craft and wisdom herself could not fault, were in pieces on the floor of a workshop in Lydia. Then she hit Arachne. Arachne could not survive the shame of that. To be struck by someone who has just destroyed your work, and who destroyed it without being able to name a single flaw, is to have your entire claim to significance negated in a single moment. She had made something perfect, and it had been torn apart by the person she had challenged, and the person had not needed to justify the destruction by pointing to a flaw. And that absence of justification was in some ways the most complete possible humiliation. She tried to hang herself. Athena stopped her. Or rather, Athena transformed her. The rope became thread. The girl became the thing that makes thread. She became a spider, small and fast, her fingers still moving with the same compulsive skill, building her webs in the corners of the world where the light does not quite reach, making structures of remarkable geometric precision that most people walk through without looking at. She has been weaving ever since. Arachne's name is why we call the study of spiders arachnology. It is why spiders are arachnids. The girl who wove the truth about the gods into cloth so perfect that the goddess of wisdom could not fault the craft lives on in every technical term for the creature she became. The taxonomy of the natural world contains her, renamed and reclassified, present everywhere and noticed rarely. Here is what the story does not resolve, and what it was not designed to resolve. Was Arachne guilty of pride? By the standards of the ancient Greek world, yes, clearly and obviously. The challenge to a god was itself the transgression, regardless of the skill that backed it up. The world she lived in had clear rules about the distance between human capacity and divine capacity, and those rules existed partly to protect humans from comparisons they could not afford to lose. Arachne violated those rules. She was young and talented, and certain that her certainty was justified, which is a combination that produces exactly the kind of collision her story documents. But her work was true. This is what Ovid encodes, and what the story cannot get around. The things she wove into her cloth, the divine behaviors she depicted with such perfect technique, were things that had happened. The images were accurate. The craft was flawless. Athena destroyed something that was true because the truth was inconvenient to the beings with the power to destroy inconvenient things. Whether she knew, this is the question that sits in the center of the story. Whether the goddess of wisdom, looking at the perfect images Arachne had woven, recognized in them something she would have preferred not to see, and responded to that recognition with the kind of action that has nothing to do with wisdom and everything to do with the simple authority of someone who can. The story ends with Arachne in the corner, still weaving, still building intricate structures in the places where the light does not quite reach. The goddess of wisdom walked away from the workshop, and the loom was destroyed, and the truth it had contained was gone, except that it was not gone, because Ovid wrote it down. And here it is, 2,000 years later, in a story about what Athena did on a particular afternoon in a village in Lydia, when a girl who was very good at something refused to pretend she was not. 3 scenes, 3 mornings, 3 people waking up to the world that Athena had arranged. The first morning is Telemachus, on the deck of a ship sailing away from Ithaca before the suitors knew he was gone. The island was getting smaller behind him. Everything he had ever known was in that diminishing shape on the horizon, and ahead of him was open water and the uncertain business of going toward the problem instead of waiting for it. He did not know a goddess had sat across from him the night before and handed him a plan. He knew only that something had shifted inside him. Some private calculation had completed itself, and that he was moving. He stood at the bow and felt the wind, and was, for the first time in years, not enduring. The second morning is Perseus, coming out of the cave at the edge of the world, with something in a bag that he had not been entirely sure he would be able to obtain. Something that had killed every person who had ever tried to look at it directly, and that he had managed to approach only by looking at its reflection. He had not been the strongest person who had ever gone looking for Medusa. He had not been the bravest. He had been the one who had listened to the instructions and used the mirror correctly, and kept his eyes on the reflection, even when every instinct told him to look at the real thing. He stood in the early light outside the cave and opened the bag just far enough to confirm what was inside, and closed it again quickly, and began the long journey back. He was carrying something that had been impossible until he had a method for it. The third morning is Orestes, but that story belongs to a later chapter, because what Athena does for Orestes is different in kind from what she does for the others, and it needs the full weight of its own telling. What these 3 mornings have in common is this: none of these people knew, in the moment, the full shape of what had been done for them. Telemachus did not know the identity of the stranger. Perseus understood that Athena had helped him, but not how completely. The method she had given him had made the difference between success and death. The help had been so precisely fitted to what each person needed that it did not announce itself as help. It announced itself as capability, as the sudden sense that a thing which had seemed impossible was, in fact, possible, provided you went about it in the right way. This is what Athena does. This is what she has always done. And it raises a question that the comfortable version of her story prefers to skip past. What does it cost to be helped by someone who is so much better at your life than you are? Telemachus became the person the situation required. Perseus succeeded at the task he had been sent to die on. These are good outcomes. Athena produced them through a combination of genuine care and extraordinary competence, and the specific kind of management that comes from seeing someone's situation more clearly than they can see it themselves. But Telemachus did not choose the plan he followed. He chose to follow a plan offered by a stranger who already knew what the plan should be. Perseus did not develop the method for approaching Medusa. He received it, fully formed, from a goddess who had already worked out the answer. At what point does that kind of help stop being help and start being something else? At what point does wisdom exercised on behalf of someone else become a kind of sovereignty over them, however benevolent? These are questions the Greek tradition does not ask directly, but they are built into the structure of what Athena does and how she does it, and they become impossible to ignore when you hold all the stories together. She is not wrong to help. The outcomes justify the interventions. Telemachus's story ends better because she sat across from him in disguise. Perseus comes home alive because she gave him the mirror. The world is measurably improved by her involvement. And yet, the spider in the corner of the room is still weaving. The girl who made something true and perfect is still in that corner. And the web she builds tonight will be walked through by someone who does not look at it. And she will build another one tomorrow. And this will continue for as long as spiders exist, which scientists tell us will be considerably longer than human beings exist. Athena built a civilization. She gave it tools and heroes and laws and the capacity to sustain itself without her direct presence. She produced, through centuries of careful intervention in the lives of people she chose, something that genuinely deserved to be called great. She also tore up the only perfect, true thing that a girl in Lydia ever made, because the truth in it was inconvenient. Both of those things are Athena. The stories that show you only one of them are not lying. Exactly. They are just showing you the part of the statue that catches the light and leaving the shadowed side for you to find on your own. Here is the shadowed side, a being of complete intelligence and genuine investment. Moving through the world with the advantage of knowing more than everyone, she helps, doing real and lasting good for the people and the city she has chosen, and never quite accountable to the people on the other end of her decisions, never required to live with the consequences of what she decides on their behalf, always already somewhere else by the time the consequences have finished arriving. That is what wisdom looks like when it has enough power to act without constraint. That is what Athena is. The next question the story has to answer is what she built with it, and what it costs to build it. That question has two more answers waiting. One in a courtroom, one in a building that is still standing on a hill above Athens, open to the sky, catching the light the way it has caught every kind of light for 2,500 years. We are going to both of them now. There is a moment in the history of the ancient Greek world when something changed that had never changed before. And it changed so quietly, in a single night in Athens, that the people who were present for it may not have fully understood what they were watching. The moment involves a man who had killed his mother. His name was Orestes. He was the son of Agamemnon, the king who had led the Greek forces at Troy, and Clytemnestra, the queen who had waited 10 years for her husband to come home from that war and had spent those 10 years deciding what she would do when he arrived. What she did was kill him. She had reasons that the Greek tradition treated seriously. Agamemnon had sacrificed their daughter Iphigenia to get favorable winds for the fleet at the beginning of the war, and Clytemnestra had spent a decade living inside that fact. And when the man who had killed her daughter walked through the door of their palace, she was ready. She killed him in his bath, with an axe, on the night he returned from Troy. Orestes was not present for this. He had been sent away as a child, kept at a distance from the politics of Mycenae, raised elsewhere, while his mother and her lover, Aegisthus, ran the kingdom his father had left behind. He grew up knowing what had happened. He grew up knowing what the laws of his world required him to do about it. The law of blood said that the murder of a father demanded vengeance by the son. This was not a legal principle written in a code somewhere. It was older than legal codes. It was the fundamental architecture of the obligation that held families together and gave the dead a claim on the living. The principle that murder without consequence was a wound that would not close and would eventually poison everything around it. The Erinyes, the Furies, the ancient goddesses of retribution who predated the Olympians and answered to none of them, enforced this law the way weather enforces itself, not through decision but through nature, through the simple fact of what they were. The Erinyes told Orestes, through the oracle at Delphi, speaking with Apollo's voice, that he was required to avenge his father. Apollo told him to go home to Mycenae and do what the law demanded. Orestes went home. He killed Aegisthus. He killed his mother. The moment the second killing happened, the Erinyes came for him. This is the trap that the story of Orestes is built on. The trap that makes it not just a revenge story, but something with genuine weight. The same law that required him to kill his mother for killing his father also required his mother's murder to be avenged. He was simultaneously fulfilling the law and violating it. Every action he took in obedience to the obligation of blood vengeance created another obligation of blood vengeance, in a chain that had no natural endpoint, that could theoretically run forever. Each killing producing the requirement for another killing, the obligation renewing itself from its own fulfillment. The Erinyes did not recognize the trap as a trap. They recognized it as their domain. They pursued Orestes across the Greek world with the focused relentlessness of creatures who have one purpose and cannot be talked out of it, cannot be negotiated with, cannot be deflected by argument or appeal or the testimony of extenuating circumstances. He had killed his mother. The matricide required punishment, that his mother had killed his father, and that he had been instructed by a god to avenge. That killing was information that the Erinyes processed and set aside, because the system they enforced did not have a category for those complications. He came to Athens. He came there because Athens was where Athena was. And Athena was the only figure in the divine world with the combination of authority and intelligence that the situation required. Apollo could advocate for him but could not adjudicate. Zeus could render a judgment, but the Erinyes would not accept it from someone whose own record was complicated. What was needed was someone who could create a process, a structure for resolving the question that all parties, including the Erinyes, would have to accept as legitimate. Athena looked at what had arrived in her city and did what she did better than anyone in the divine world. She understood the actual problem. The actual problem was not Orestes. Orestes was the occasion for the problem. But the problem was structural. The system of blood vengeance was a loop with no exit. It had served its purpose for as long as human communities were small enough and isolated enough that the self-enforcing nature of family obligation was the only available mechanism for something resembling justice. But communities had grown. Cities had formed. The scale of human organization had reached a point where the loop was no longer serving its purpose and had started producing exactly the kind of endless, self-perpetuating violence it had originally been designed to prevent. The Erinyes were not wrong. They were old. There is a difference. Athena did not defeat the Erinyes. She did not overrule them or cast them out or declare their ancient authority invalid. She understood that beings with that much accumulated power and that much purchase on the fundamental structure of obligation could not simply be cancelled. What she did was more sophisticated and more durable. She gave them somewhere else to be. But before that, she built the thing that would replace the function they had been serving. She called a jury, 12 citizens of Athens, mortals, people who had been born and would die, and who understood, from the inside, what it cost to live in a world where decisions about justice had permanent consequences. She did not appoint divine arbiters. She did not convene a council of gods. She called human citizens and told them they were going to hear the case of Orestes and that their votes were going to determine the outcome. Picture that room for a moment, 12 people sitting in judgment. A man who killed his mother standing at the center. The ancient goddesses of vengeance surrounding the proceedings like weather waiting to happen. Apollo arguing the case for the defense. The whole accumulated weight of a justice system that was about to be replaced, pressing down on a single night in Athens. The jury voted. The result was a tie. Athena cast the deciding vote for acquittal. The reasoning she offered has been debated for 2,500 years. She said that in a case involving the killing of a mother versus the killing of a father, she sided with the father. And the reasoning she gave touched on questions about parentage and lineage that the ancient world answered differently than we answer them now. The reasoning has been criticized by people who find it inadequate, and some of those criticisms are fair. But the reasoning was almost beside the point. What she had done was not primarily about this particular case. It was about the structure she had built to hear it. She had created, in a single night, the machinery by which cases like this would be heard from now on. not by ancient goddesses enforcing ancient law through relentless supernatural pursuit, by citizens, with a process, with rules for evidence and argument and the counting of votes, with a structure that could accommodate complication and nuance and the specific circumstances of specific situations in a way that the Erinyes, for all their power, could never do. She had moved the resolution of human conflict from the realm of nature to the realm of institution. This is the most consequential thing she does in the entire surviving tradition of stories about her. Not the battle with Poseidon for Athens, not the guidance of Odysseus, not the support for the Greeks at Troy. This, the creation of the process by which a society decides what justice means and who gets to determine it. Now she had to deal with the Erinyes. They were furious in the way that beings are furious when the world has reorganized itself around them without consulting them. They threatened Athens. They threatened to make the soil barren, to blight the crops, to turn the earth against the people who had allowed this to happen. They were very old, and they were very powerful, and they had just watched their entire domain of authority be absorbed into a new structure that did not require them. Athena did not fight them. She talked to them. The conversation that follows in Aeschylus's play, The Eumenides, is one of the most extraordinary passages in ancient Greek literature, because it is a conversation between the old world and the new one, between the principle of force and the principle of institution. And the new one wins, not by defeating the old one, but by finding a place for it inside the new structure. She offered the Erinyes a home in Athens, not as enforcers of blood vengeance, but as something more nuanced and harder to name, the guardians of the fear that makes civic order possible, the deep unease that lives below the surface of a well-functioning society and prevents it from becoming complacent. Every city needs the thing they represent, the sense that some violations are so fundamental they cannot be rationalized away, that some acts carry weight that argument cannot fully lift. Athens needed that. She offered them honor and worship and a permanent place in the city's life. They accepted. They went underground, literally, into the earth, beneath Athens, and the Athenians honored them with torchlit processions and the kind of careful reverence you offer to something you want to remain where it is. Their name changed. They became the Eumenides, the kindly ones, their nature softened by the transformation from avengers to guardians, from the face of retribution to the feeling of conscience. She had taken the thing that was too old and too powerful to simply end, and she had given it a new purpose inside the new order. She had not defeated the past. She had absorbed it, which is more efficient than defeating it and considerably more stable. This is the thing about the trial of Orestes that is easy to miss when you focus on the verdict. The verdict was almost incidental. What mattered was the hill, and the 12 citizens, and the process, and the transformation of the Erinyes from force into institution. The hill was the Areopagus. The court Athena created on it that night became one of the foundational institutions of Athenian legal life, one of the ancestors of every court in the Western tradition, the original model for the idea that disputes should be resolved by a structured process with rules rather than by force or by the authority of whoever happened to be strongest. She built something that night that did not need her. This is the pattern that runs through everything she does. The olive tree that grows without her. The mirror method that Perseus carries into the cave without her beside him. The plan that Telemachus follows without knowing she gave it to him. The court on the hill that keeps functioning after she has moved on to wherever she moves on to. She builds things designed to outlast her presence. Whether that is generosity or a coping mechanism for a being who cannot stay is a question the stories approach and then leave open. She stood on the Areopagus and created the machinery of justice, and then she went somewhere else, and the court continued to function without her. The hill is still there. The court is gone. Or rather, it became the ancestor of things that are still there. In the structure of every legal system in the Western world that inherited the Greek tradition of deciding disputes through process rather than power. She built that. She is not in it. She was never going to be in it. That was always the design. In the spring of 447 BC, on the hill above Athens, workers began cutting into the limestone of the Acropolis to prepare the foundation for a building. Not just any building. The city that commissioned this work was at the peak of what a city can be, or believed itself to be, which in the short term amounts to the same thing. Athens had survived the Persian invasion 60 years earlier, had watched the Persians burn the Acropolis to the ground, had driven them back, had spent the following decades becoming the center of a naval empire. It was wealthy in the way that cities are wealthy when they are at the center of a network of obligation, which is to say, extravagantly wealthy by the standards of its time and place. Pericles, the political leader who drove the decision to build, understood something about the relationship between a city's image of itself and its actual power that has not changed in the 2.5 millennia since. Cities that want to remain at the center of things build monuments. They build things that are bigger and more beautiful than what exists already, that require the kind of resources only a city at the center of things can command, that demonstrate in stone and gold and the accumulated labor of thousands of people that the city which made this is a city that cannot be ignored. The Parthenon was going to be a demonstration, but it was also going to be a temple. And the distinction matters. And the Athenians held both things simultaneously in a way that was completely natural to them. The building was a political statement and a religious dedication, and these were not in tension. The goddess was the city. The city was the goddess. To honor Athena magnificently was to celebrate Athens magnificently. And the building on the hill said, "This is who we are." And the goddess it housed said, "This is what we believe wisdom and war and civilization look like when they are taken seriously." The sculptor in charge of the entire decorative program was Phidias. What he designed for the interior of the building was the statue that everything about the building had been leading toward, the Athena Parthenos. Athena, the Virgin, close to 40 feet tall, constructed around a wooden core, surfaced in ivory for the skin and gold for the armor and clothing. The quantity of gold was so substantial that Pericles reportedly told the Athenian assembly it could be removed and melted down in a financial emergency, which tells you something about how the Athenians understood the relationship between religious dedication and practical resources. She stood in the interior chamber, in a space designed entirely around her presence. Her right hand held a small figure of Nike, victory, winged, offering a crown. Her left hand held the shield. On the outside of the shield, the battle of the Greeks against the Amazons. On the inside, the battle of the gods against the giants. On her sandals, the battle of the Lapiths against the centaurs. The aegis across her chest with the Gorgonian at its center. Every surface was a story about civilization defending itself against the forces that would undo it. The exterior of the building continued this program. The metopes on the south side showed the Lapiths fighting the centaurs again. Reason fighting unreason. The human form fighting the hybrid form that the Greeks used to represent the failure to be fully human. The east pediment showed the birth of Athena, the moment of the split skull, the emergence, the assembled gods of Olympus witnessing what had arrived. The west pediment showed the contest with Poseidon, the olive tree, the moment of choice. The entire building was the story of Athena told in marble, and running along the top of the interior colonnade, in the place least easily seen from ground level, requiring you to press into the shadow and look up at an angle to see it clearly, was the frieze that is now the most discussed element of the Parthenon. Not gods, not heroes, not the battles and the monsters and the mythological episodes that covered every other surface. People, citizens of Athens, young men on horses and young men on foot, women carrying sacred objects, older men in the dignified postures of civic authority, animals being led towards sacrifice. The entire community of Athens, rendered in marble, moving through the space at the top of the colonnade, moving toward Athena. The choice to put real Athenians on this building, in the position they occupy, is the most revealing thing about the Parthenon's actual meaning. All the battles and monsters on the outside, and on the inside, the citizens, the people the building was actually for, moving toward the goddess, who was supposed to be their patron and protector, bringing themselves, ordinary and mortal and particular, to the relationship that the building was designed to celebrate. The Parthenon was not primarily a statement about Athena. It was a statement about what Athens believed about the relationship between a people and the principles they organized themselves around. The statue inside was extraordinary. The frieze running above it was the point. It took roughly 9 years to complete. It was finished around 438 BC. In the years when Sophocles was writing and Socrates was talking in the agora, and the democracy was functioning with enough vitality that it could argue with itself in public and survive the argument, the statue stood inside for roughly 1,000 years, until the late classical period, when it was either destroyed or removed to Constantinople. The exact fate of the Athena Parthenos is not known. The most precisely crafted image of the goddess of wisdom, nearly 40 feet of gold and ivory, built by the best sculptor in the ancient world, paid for by the most powerful city of its time, disappeared from the historical record sometime in the 5th or 6th century AD. What remains is the building. The Parthenon has been many things in the 2,000 years since the statue disappeared. It was converted to a Christian church in the Byzantine period, dedicated to the Virgin Mary. It was converted to a mosque after the Ottoman conquest of Athens in 1458 AD. In 1687 AD, the Venetians bombarded Athens during a war with the Ottomans, and a cannonball hit the Parthenon, which the Ottomans had been using as an ammunition store. The explosion destroyed the interior, collapsed the roof, and blew out many of the walls. The explosion is why the building looks the way it looks now, open to the sky, columns without a ceiling, a structure that is most of what it was, missing the part that would make it a building rather than a ruin. In the early 19th century, Thomas Bruce, the 7th Earl of Elgin, removed roughly half of the surviving sculptural decoration and shipped it to London, where it remains in the British Museum. The Greek government calls the pieces the Parthenon sculptures and requests their return every year and has not yet received them. The frieze with the Athenians processing toward their goddess is cut in half. Some of it is in Athens, some of it is in London. The procession has been interrupted for 200 years. This is the building that Pericles commissioned as a permanent demonstration of what Athens was. This is the building that Pheidias filled with the image of the goddess, who had chosen Athens because Athens chose intelligence over raw power. This is the building that has been blown up, converted, stripped, divided, and turned into a tourist destination. And that is still, despite all of that, the most beautiful thing many of the people who see it will ever see. It stands on its hill, the way the questions it was built to ask still stand incompletely answered. Open to the sky, enormous, even in ruin. What do we mean when we say wisdom? What does a civilization look like when it takes that word seriously? What are we willing to build, willing to pay for, willing to place at the highest point of our most visible hill? When we try to give the idea of intelligence a shape that people can walk up to and stand beneath and feel, the Parthenon is Athens' answer. Broken and divided and open to the weather, and full of visitors who are trying to take a photograph that captures something a photograph cannot capture. It is still the answer. Rome did not steal the Greek gods. This is the version of the story that people who want a simple account tend to tell, and it misses something important. The Romans did not look at the Greek pantheon and decide to take it wholesale, rename everything, and call it their own. What happened was considerably more complicated and more interesting. The kind of thing that happens when a culture of enormous practical sophistication encounters a culture of enormous intellectual sophistication, and both of them are trying to figure out what to do with the collision. Rome had its own religious tradition. It was old and deeply practical, organized around the relationship between the community and the divine, in terms that were almost contractual. You performed the right rituals at the right times in the right ways. And the gods held up their end of an arrangement that kept the crops growing, and the armies winning, and the city standing. Roman religion was not primarily about stories. It was about procedure. Picture a Roman family on a March morning. In the days before the Quinquatrus festival, a father checking the offerings his household has prepared, a mother adjusting her daughter's dress for the procession, a son, 12 years old, carrying a wax tablet to the school that will be closed today in honor of the goddess of learning, which means a holiday, which means he is carrying the tablet only because his father told him to look prepared. They are going to honor Minerva, not Athena, Minerva, and the difference matters. Minerva had existed in Rome before the Greeks arrived in any significant cultural force. She was part of the Capitoline triad alongside Jupiter and Juno, one of the three foundational deities of Roman civic religion. Honored in the great temple on the Capitoline Hill, that was the symbolic center of Roman religious life. Her domain was craft, skill, the intelligent application of technique to the making of things. She was the goddess of craftspeople and teachers and doctors and musicians. She was the patron of the things that required a trained mind, working in conjunction with trained hands. She was not a war goddess. This is the most significant difference between Minerva and Athena, and it is not a small difference. Athena's involvement in warfare, her presence on battlefields, her guidance of heroes through combat, her rivalry with Ares on the plains of Troy. All of this was central to who she was in the Greek tradition. Minerva in Rome was the goddess of school, of the workshop, of the healing room. When the two traditions encountered each other, what emerged was a figure who carried both inheritances. The Roman Minerva gained depth, gained story, gained the mythological richness that the Greek tradition offered. She gained Perseus and Arachne and Troy and the birth from the head of Jupiter, which is what Zeus became in the Roman version. She gained the owl and the olive tree and the aegis. She became, in the literary tradition that educated Romans absorbed, a fully realized mythological personality. What she lost, or rather what she redistributed, was the warrior aspect. Rome had Mars, and Mars was not Ares. This distinction matters as much as the distinction between Minerva and Athena. Ares in the Greek tradition was chaos, was blood for its own sake, was the god that other gods found embarrassing and humans feared without respect. Mars in the Roman tradition was something considerably more dignified, the father of Romulus and Remus, the ancestor of the Roman people, the divine patron of organized military expansion. Rome could not afford to have its primary war god be the kind of liability that Ares was in Homer. Rome needed a war god it could be proud of, so Mars absorbed what Ares had been and elevated it. And Minerva, who in the Greek tradition had shared the war domain with the intelligence aspect. He found herself in a Roman world where the war belonged to Mars and the intelligence belonged to her, and the two were more cleanly separated than they had ever been in Athens. This changes what she means. Athena was interesting partly because of the tension between her two primary domains. The way that wisdom and war in the same being forced the question of what their relationship was, whether they supported each other or contradicted each other, whether strategic violence was wisdom's highest expression or wisdom's greatest temptation. That tension lives in almost every story about her in the Greek tradition. It lives in the Aegis and the Gorgonion. It lives in the lie she told Hector. It lives in Arachne's workshop. Minerva, separated from the war domain, becomes something cleaner. She is what wisdom looks like when it is not required to justify itself in relation to violence. She is the patron of people who make things with their minds and hands, who teach, who heal, who create the infrastructure of knowledge that a civilization runs on. She is, in this form, more comfortable to spend time with, less likely to appear beside you on a battlefield and tell you something that will turn out to be a lie. Ovid, who wrote in the 1st century BC under the Emperor Augustus, is the Roman writer who most fully developed Minerva as a mythological personality, and his Minerva is complicated in exactly the ways that the Greek Athena was complicated. She is the one who turns Arachne into a spider. She is present in the transformation stories that make up the metamorphoses, with all the ambivalence and the complexity that the Greek tradition gave her. She has not been softened into something merely respectable, but she exists. In Ovid's world, inside a literary culture that is asking questions about the relationship between individual talent and institutional authority, between the person who creates and the state that decides what creation is permitted to mean. Augustus was in the process of transforming the Roman Republic into something that called itself a republic and functioned as an autocracy, and the writers of his era were navigating, with varying degrees of success and anxiety, the question of how much truth a person could put into their work without the work becoming a problem for the person. Ovid was eventually exiled by Augustus. The precise reasons are disputed. Involving his poetry and a political mistake, the historical record does not fully clarify. He spent the last decade of his life in a town on the Black Sea called Tomis, writing letters to Rome that Rome did not answer, asking for a pardon that never came. The man who wrote the most developed Latin account of Minerva punishing Arachne for making something true and beautiful and inconvenient to power died far from the city he loved, in exile from the culture he had spent his life celebrating. Whether he noticed the parallel is not recorded. What the Roman Minerva represents, in the fullness of her tradition, is what happens to the idea of wisdom when it is absorbed into the structure of a state. She becomes more respectable, more focused on the kinds of intelligence that the state can use and honor and institutionalize, less associated with the battlefield, where even the best strategies can fail, where the god of wisdom can stand beside you and the god of chaos can still win on a given day. The Roman state needed wisdom it could manage. Minerva fit inside that requirement in ways that the full complexity of Athena did not quite fit. She sat in the Capitoline triad between Jupiter and Juno, her role defined by her position in the hierarchy, her personality shaped by what the hierarchy needed her to represent, and she was honored correctly and reliably and in accordance with procedure, and somewhere in the Greek literary tradition that the Romans had absorbed but not entirely tamed. Athena was still appearing in disguise in the doorways of people who needed something she knew how to give, still looking at the mirror shields she had provided and the webs in the corners and the courts on hills, still moving through situations with the particular quality of intelligence that does not announce itself and does not wait to be thanked. The goddess had become a goddess of the state. The state had become, in some important sense, hers. Whether she would have found this satisfying is the kind of question that has no answer. She was, in the end, always better at building things than at inhabiting them. Hold a coin, not a modern coin. A coin from the 5th century BC, from the Athens of Pericles and Phidias and Sophocles, from the city that was building the Parthenon and writing the plays that would be performed for 2,500 years. On one side, Athena, her face in profile, wearing the helmet, the crest visible above her head, the eye rendered in the frontal gaze that Greek art used for eyes, even in profile views, giving her the quality of looking at you even when her face is turned away. On the other side, an owl, small, upright, facing you directly. To the left of the owl, an olive sprig. To the right, the first three letters of the name of the city, above the owl's right shoulder, a small crescent moon. This coin circulated across the entire Mediterranean world for over 200 years. It was found in hoards from Egypt to the Black Sea to the edges of the Persian Empire. Merchants who had never been to Athens and would never go to Athens kept these coins in their purses and used them to buy things in markets from one end of the known world to the other. A trader in Carthage, handling a shipment of cedar wood, accepting payment. He does not worship Athena. He does not know her stories. He knows the owl on the coin because the owl on the coin is money, which is its own kind of religion. A soldier in the pay of a Persian governor, far from home, saving coins in a clay jar buried under the floor of his room. He will die before he retrieves them. 2,000 years later, an archaeologist will find the jar and count the coins, and write in a notebook that the Athenian tetradrachm traveled further than almost any object produced by any ancient culture. The owl was on all of them. The image of the owl as a symbol of wisdom has been continuous from those coins to the present day. It appears on the logos of universities and on the emblems of scholarly organizations and in the illustration traditions of children's books, where a wise old owl dispenses advice to the other animals in the forest. When a culture reaches for a visual shorthand for intelligence, for learning, for the particular quality of mind that sees clearly in conditions where others are confused, it very often reaches for an owl. We have been doing this for roughly 2,500 years. The question worth asking is why the owl specifically. The eagle is larger and more powerful and more visually impressive. The dolphin, which the Greeks also associated with intelligence, is more graceful. The fox, which appears in their fables as the embodiment of cunning, is more obviously strategic. The owl, the answer the Greeks encoded in their iconography, has several layers, and all of them say something specific about what they believed wisdom actually was. The owl sees in darkness. An owl's eyes are structured differently from the eyes of most birds, adapted for low-light conditions, capable of resolving detail in near darkness that would be invisible to other creatures. An owl hunting at midnight is using a perceptual capacity that has no equivalent in the daylit world. It is operating in conditions where other creatures have to stop, where the available information drops below the threshold required for confident action, and it is not stopping. The Greeks made this the defining image of wisdom, not the ability to see everything clearly in full light, the ability to see when the light is gone. This distinction says something specific about what the Greeks believed wisdom actually was, which is not the same as what we sometimes assume they believed. Wisdom, in this image, is not the kind of intelligence that functions well under ideal conditions, that reasons correctly when given complete information and sufficient time. It is the kind that functions under conditions of uncertainty, partial information, inadequate light. The wisdom that matters, the wisdom that the owl represents, is the wisdom that works in the dark. Athena's wisdom, across the stories we have examined, is consistently this kind. She does not appear in situations where the right answer is obvious and just needs someone intelligent enough to state it. She appears in situations where the available information is incomplete, where the stakes are high, where the obvious approaches do not work, where seeing clearly requires a method that most people do not naturally use. Perseus, in the cave, the direct approach is fatal, and Athena provides the indirect one. Telemachus, in his occupied house, the direct approach of confrontation is beyond his current capacity, and Athena gives him the indirect one of speech and departure. Orestes, pursued by the Erinyes, the direct approach of endless blood, vengeance, is a loop without exit, and Athena builds the indirect institutional structure that can resolve what force cannot. The owl sees in darkness by having a different kind of eye. The second quality the owl embodies is silence. An owl hunting is silent in a way that is almost difficult to believe if you have only ever heard birds that make noise when they fly. The wing feathers of owls are structured to break up the air turbulence that produces sound, so that they can approach prey in complete silence. The first indication a mouse has that an owl is present is the talons closing. The silence is not incidental to the hunting. It is the method. Athena moves through the world this way. She achieves her results through disguise, through indirect speech, through the arrangement of circumstances rather than the declaration of intentions. She does not announce herself. She appears as a stranger and talks in the voice of a stranger and leaves before the person she helped knows who was there. The influence precedes the identification. The owl and the goddess hunt the same way. The third quality is less often discussed. The owl's eyes do not move. An owl's eyeballs are fixed in the skull. They cannot rotate. An owl that wants to look at something to its left has to turn its entire head, which is why owls can rotate their heads to an angle that looks impossible to anyone who encounters it for the first time. The eyes stay still. The Greeks knew this. They rendered the owl on their coins in frontal view, both eyes visible, staring directly at the viewer, because that is how an owl presents itself facing you. Both eyes on you, unmoving. This quality in the image says something about Athena's gaze. She looks at things directly and does not look away. She can look at the face of Medusa, reflected in the shield, and see it clearly enough to tell Perseus exactly what to do. She can look at the situation of Orestes and see it clearly enough to build the institution that resolves it. She can look at what Arachne wove and see that it is true and destroy it anyway, and know that she is doing both things simultaneously. She does not look away from what she sees. The coin traveled from Athens to Egypt to the Black Sea and back again, passing through hands that belonged to people who spoke different languages and honored different gods and organized their lives according to different principles. And in all of those hands, the small owl on the silver disc was recognizable as a symbol of the same thing: intelligence that functions in darkness, influence that moves in silence, attention that does not look away. These qualities survived the goddess who embodied them. They outlasted the specific religion that generated the iconography. They migrated through the Roman tradition and the medieval tradition and into the modern world. Available now on the crests of universities and the covers of children's books and the logos of organizations that want to communicate that they take the life of the mind seriously. The goddess, whose stories we have been telling throughout this account, is largely unknown to the people who put owls on their institutional emblems. They are not honoring Athena. They are honoring an idea that Athena once embodied, that her stories once illustrated, that the Greek tradition once organized into a coherent mythology of what intelligence looks like when it is working at its best. The idea survived. The goddess became, over the centuries, the residue of the idea, the original image that the symbol came from, before it was abstracted into something more general and less complicated. She is still in it. You have to look carefully to see her, but she is there. In every owl that signals wisdom, in every image of a bird that stares without blinking at a world it sees more clearly than the world suspects. The owl outlasted the empire that minted the coins. It outlasted the goddess whose attribute it was. It outlasted the religion and the temples and the language and the political arrangements that produced it. In a city somewhere in the world right now, a university student is walking past the seal of her institution without looking at it. The way she walks past it every day. The seal has an owl on it. She is late for class. She does not stop. The owl watches her go. It has always been watching. It will be watching long after she and the institution and the city and the era that produced all three of them are gone. This is how the things that matter survive, not by staying in the place they started, by becoming so thoroughly embedded in how a culture thinks that the culture cannot imagine thinking differently, cannot construct its symbols of intelligence without reaching, eventually, for the image of a bird that sees in darkness and moves in silence and looks at the world with eyes that do not turn away. Athena described something real. It outlasted her. There is a night in the Odyssey, deep in the poem, that does not get discussed as often as the more dramatic passages, and it is the one that stays with you longest when you are thinking about Athena. Odysseus is on the island of the nymph Calypso. He has been there for 7 years. Calypso loves him, in the way that a being of considerable power loves someone she has decided she wants, which is to say completely and without much consideration for what the person she loves actually wants. She has offered him immortality. She has offered him an end to the wandering, a permanent home, a body that will not age, and a life that will not end, on a beautiful island in the middle of the sea, with a being who is genuinely devoted to him. He sits on the shore every day and looks at the water and weeps. He wants to go home, not to immortality, not to beauty and permanence, and the love of a divine being who has organized her entire existence around his comfort, to Ithaca, to Penelope, who is aging and besieged, and not immortal and not easy and entirely his, to a life that will end, in a place that is ordinary, with people who are complicated and mortal, and his. Calypso's offer was better by almost any measurable standard. Odysseus wept on the shore and wanted Ithaca anyway. Athena arranged for him to leave. She made the arguments to Zeus. She navigated the politics of Poseidon's anger. She opened the door that allowed Odysseus to build a raft and sail away from the island where he was being loved completely, back toward the island where he was needed. She gave him the thing he wanted. But Calypso's question, the one she asked Zeus's messenger Hermes when he arrived to tell her Odysseus had to go, is the question that stays with me when I think about what this story is actually about. Calypso asked, why do the gods begrudge the goddesses their mortal loves? She was asking about something the stories return to over and over, the specific grief that comes from loving someone who will not stay, who cannot stay, who is made of the stuff that ends. She was asking about the cost of that kind of attachment, the one that goes in, knowing it is temporary, and goes in anyway. And she was asking it in the voice of someone who was living that cost in real time. Athena was not Calypso. Athena was not Eos, who loved the mortal Tithonus and asked for his immortality and forgot to ask for his eternal youth, and watched him age past the point of recognition into something that could not die and could not live. Athena was not Aphrodite, weeping over Adonis, in the myth that the Greeks told to explain why beautiful things die in the spring. Athena was the goddess who organized Odysseus's departure from an island where someone loved him. She did this because she loved him, in the specific and particular way that Athena loves the people she chooses, which is to say she was invested in his outcome. She valued his nature. She had been watching and waiting and working for 20 years toward the moment when he would be home. She helped him leave Calypso because getting him home was the goal, and Calypso was an obstacle to the goal. And Athena is very good at moving through obstacles. What she could not give him was the thing Calypso was offering. What she could not be for him was the thing that Calypso was. Because Athena does not stay, she has never stayed. Staying is not what she does. Now consider the gods who do stay. Demeter loses Persephone every year, without exception. Her daughter goes into the underworld for a season, and Demeter's grief at that loss is so total that the earth stops producing. The seasons themselves are the trace of a mother's grief on the surface of the world. Demeter has everything a goddess has, and she spends a third of every year in the specific agony of separation from the person she loves most. And nothing about being a goddess makes that agony smaller. Hera loves Zeus. She loves him with the full and serious force of a being whose emotional capacity is not smaller than a human being's, but considerably larger. And he is unfaithful to her with a consistency that makes infidelity look like a defining characteristic rather than a lapse. She is the queen of the gods, and she cannot make the person she has chosen to love treat her the way she deserves to be treated. Her power extends to earthquakes and the fates of cities and the outcomes of wars. It does not extend to this. Aphrodite loves Ares, who is dangerous and destructive, and by most reckonings, the worst possible choice. And she loves him anyway, with the helpless quality that loving a bad choice has. And when Hephaestus catches them together and displays them to the laughter of the assembled gods, the humiliation is real, and she carries it. These goddesses suffer. They suffer in ways that map onto the ways human beings suffer, that the Greeks encoded in their divine stories, precisely because the encoding allowed them to look at the shape of their own pain from a safer distance. The losses of the gods were large enough to see clearly. The losses of human beings were often too close and too small to examine directly. Athena does not appear in this catalogue. She does not lose anyone the way Demeter loses Persephone. She does not love anyone the way Hera loves Zeus. She is not caught in a net of her own desire the way Aphrodite is. The things that make the other goddesses most vulnerable are also the things that make their existence most unmistakably alive, most recognizably continuous with the human experience of being alive, which is an experience defined at every point by the presence and absence of the people who matter to you. Athena has her city. She has her heroes. She has her work. This is not nothing. The relationship between Athena and Athens, and between Athena and the specific mortals she chose, has a quality of genuine investment that the stories make consistently clear. She is not indifferent. She wants Odysseus home. She wants the trial of Orestes to produce justice. She wants Athens to become what she believes it can become. But these investments cannot be taken from her in the specific way that love can be taken from you. If Odysseus had died before reaching Ithaca, if Athens had been destroyed, Athena would have been diminished in some way that mattered. She would not have been broken. The goddesses who love the way Demeter loves Persephone can be broken. The love that can be taken from you has that quality. Athena was built, from the moment of her emergence from her father's skull, without that particular vulnerability. She arrived wearing armor, and the armor was not only the bronze and gold that Pheidias would later render in his statue. It was the structure of her attachments, which were real and genuine, and not the kind that could leave her sitting on a shore weeping for something she could not have. In some later traditions, there is a story about a girl named Pallas, a companion of Athena's, a friend from before Troy, before the heroes, before the city, a girl who was killed accidentally during a sparring match, a spear thrust that went wrong. The girl falling before Athena fully understood what had happened. The grief of that loss, the tradition says, was so total that Athena added the name Pallas to her own and carried it forward into every story that came after, as both memorial and wound. This tradition is not in Homer. It is not in the oldest sources. It appears in later writers, in regional accounts, in the kind of story that gets attached to a figure when later generations feel that something is missing from the earlier accounts. And what was missing, what later storytellers seem to have needed to supply, was this a wound, a loss that had reached her in the way that losses reach the people who are not protected by completeness from the beginning. The name Pallas is the trace of that need, the idea that somewhere in her story, before the armor became permanent, there was a moment when something got through. Whether the story is historically accurate, in whatever sense historical accuracy applies to mythology, is less interesting than the question of why it persists. Why tellers who came after Homer felt the need to give Athena a wound. Why the figure of the goddess of wisdom, surveying her domain from the height of complete self-possession, made people reach for something that would make her more continuous with the human experience of loss. They reached for it because a being without wounds is not quite intelligible to beings who are defined by theirs. There is a type of person in the human world who has developed such thorough capability, such comprehensive ability to assess and respond and perform at a high level in every situation, that the people around them are never quite sure whether the person is fully present or whether they are watching a very good performance of presence. These people are often extraordinary. They are often very good at what they do. They are also in the private place that the performance does not reach, sometimes alone in a way that has no obvious remedy, because the very completeness that makes them effective keeps the world from being able to touch them in the way that would relieve the aloneness. Athena was this, at the scale of a goddess. She sat across from Telemachus in the form of an old man, and she genuinely wanted him to become what he was capable of becoming. She stood beside Odysseus on the shore of Ithaca and felt something in the vicinity of what friendship feels like when the other person finally sees you clearly. She watched the Parthenon rise on the hill above her city and valued, with something that was not quite pride and not quite love, but was in the territory of both, what it represented. And she was also, in some structural way, that the stories never quite name, but consistently demonstrate, not reachable in the way that the people she helped were reachable. She was there, and then she was gone, and the people she had been with did not know, most of the time, that they had been in the presence of something that found them genuinely interesting and was also not available in the way that would have made the relationship fully mutual. She gave Odysseus 20 years of her attention and a path home. What he gave her in return, what anyone she helped gave her in return, was the opportunity to watch them succeed. Whether that was enough is a question she would not have answered. She was too intelligent to answer a question whose answer she could not use. If it was not enough, there was nothing to be done about it, because her nature was her nature, and she had known that since the first moment of her existence. She kept the name Pallas. If the tradition is right, she kept moving. The city she had chosen to protect became the most celebrated in the ancient world. The men she had guided became the most famous heroes in the tradition. The institutions she built became the ancestors of institutions that still exist. And in the corners where the light does not quite reach, a spider went on weaving, building and rebuilding, never finished, never acknowledged, entirely committed to the task. The goddess moved on. The spider stayed. Athens at 3 in the morning. The tourists are gone. The vendors who sell miniature Parthenons and reproductions of the owl coins and refrigerator magnets with Athena's helmeted profile are gone. The buses are gone. The Acropolis sits above the city in the darkness, and for a few hours it exists as something closer to what it has always been, stone and time, and the particular quality of presence that very old things have when there is no one around to interpret them. The Parthenon does not look finished in the daylight either, but in the daylight the visitors and the reconstruction scaffolding and the information signs give you somewhere else to put your attention. They give you the mediated experience that has been prepared for you, tell you what you are looking at before you have had a chance to figure it out yourself. In the dark, there is no mediation. There is the hill and the columns and the sky above Athens and the city below it. And you are alone with the fact that this was built 2,500 years ago by people who are entirely gone, and that it is still standing. Imperfectly. Roofless. Inhabited by reconstruction equipment and the nesting birds that have been living in its stones since before anyone now alive was born. The goddess who lived here is also gone, in the sense that the specific religious practice that made this building a temple rather than a monument has not been practiced here for well over 1,000 years. The last priests of Athena Parthenos, the last people who came to this hill to do what it was built for, rather than to look at what it was, lived and died before the fall of Rome. What remains is the question the building was built to embody. We have spent 18 chapters with Athena, following the long arc of her story, from the darkness inside Zeus's skull to the owl on the coins, to the Parthenon, to the Roman tradition, to the survival of her symbols into the present. We have watched her help heroes and build institutions and make choices that were not always comfortable, and destroy things that deserve to continue, and continue things that deserve to be questioned. She did not change. She was the same in the first story And the last one. The same intelligence operating from the same orientation. The same armor on. The same eyes that did not look away. The thing that changed was our understanding of what we were looking at. At the beginning, a goddess of wisdom, respectable, important, the patron of the greatest city in the ancient world, the figure on the coins, the statue in the temple. Then, something more complicated, a goddess born from fear and swallowed wisdom, carrying an inheritance she could not fully name, a goddess who protected with the face of something terrible, a goddess who appeared in your doorway as a stranger and changed your life and left before you knew who she was, a goddess who told a dying man a lie and destroyed a girl's perfect work and built a court that outlasted her and kept the name of a friend she had lost, if the later stories are right, because the name was all she had left of the one moment when something had gotten through. The building on the hill was not built for the simple version of her. The Athenians who quarried that limestone and hauled it up the slope and spent 9 years turning it into the most celebrated structure in the Western tradition knew all the stories. They knew about the judgment of Paris and the lie to Hector and Arachne in the corner and the name Pallas that came from somewhere the oldest accounts do not quite reach. They knew that the goddess they were honoring was not straightforwardly good and was not straightforwardly wise in the way that wisdom is supposed to be good. They built the Parthenon anyway. They built it because the question she embodied was worth that much effort. The question of what intelligence is for. The question of whether wisdom and power can coexist in the same thing without one corrupting the other. The question of what you lose when you are born knowing everything and what you gain, and whether the trade is one that anyone who had a choice would make. These are not ancient questions. They are questions that every generation that has inherited the tradition of the Parthenon has been asking in the terms available to it, which change with the era, but do not change the underlying shape of what is being asked. We are asking them now, about the people and the institutions we trust with the things we value, about whether expertise and goodness are the same thing or two different things that sometimes coincide, about what happens to intelligence when it has enough power to act without being accountable to the people its actions affect. We are asking them with urgency. In a moment when the relationship between knowledge and power is changing faster than our frameworks for understanding it can keep up with. Athena is the oldest version of the question we are asking. She is the 40-foot statue that used to stand inside that building. Gold and ivory and 40 feet of mortal aspiration, toward the principle that intelligence could be something worth building, the most important thing in your city around. She is the Gorgonian on the chest of that statue. The face that could not be looked at directly. The face that was worn by the goddess who taught you to look at it in reflection. She is the spider in the corner, building and rebuilding, in the places where the light does not quite reach. She is the owl on the coin that traveled from Athens to Egypt to the Black Sea, recognized everywhere as the symbol of something the human world keeps needing and keeps struggling to fully trust. She is the name that was kept. Pallas, the wound that later generations needed to imagine. Because a being of complete intelligence and no wounds is finally not something you can look at for very long without needing to add something to the picture. Some trace of the cost of being what she was. She is the building on the hill that was blown up by an ammunition explosion and stripped of half its sculpture by a Scottish earl and divided between two countries that cannot agree on where it belongs, and that is still, after all of that, the most beautiful thing many of the people who see it will ever see. She is the question the Athenians could not answer and could not stop asking. And they answered it. The only way anyone answers a question they cannot resolve. They built something around it, something enormous and precise and made to last, designed to outlast them, designed to carry the question forward into hands they would never shake and ears they would never speak into. The question arrived here. The question is still going. The Parthenon stands above Athens in the 3 a.m. darkness, and the floodlights are off, and the city hums below it. with the continuous noise of a place where several million people are sleeping or working or moving through the night, carrying their own questions, mostly unaware that, above them, on a limestone hill, 2,500 years of accumulated wondering about the same thing is sitting in the dark, open to the sky, waiting for morning. The goddess is in the stone. She is in the question. She is in the spider, in the corner of a room somewhere in the world right now, building another web in the dark, doing the only thing she knows how to do, which is to make something intricate and true and precise in the place where the light does not quite reach, and then make it again when it is destroyed. She has never left. She has never been exactly here. Both things are true. They have always been true. The columns catch the first grey light of the Athens morning. Another day, beginning underneath a building that was built to ask what wisdom is for. The question is still open. It has always been open. That is not a failure. That is the point.